The rain has not let up since dusk. It patters steadily across the windows of Baker Street, soft as ticking against glass. From the second-floor sitting room, the world outside is a palette of gray-blue shadows and blurred yellow lamps, distorted by the droplets. A low coal fire hums in the hearth, its orange flicker barely competing with the gloom. The scent of damp wool and old paper lingers in the air, quiet and familiar dot below. The street glistens like oilskin. Cobblestones collect shallow puddles, each one cradling reflections of gaslight and silhouette. A carriage turns the corner, wheels whispering over wet stone, its outline ghostly. The clip-clop of horses' hooves fades into the hush again. All remains still except for the rain, the occasional groan of the old pipes, and a ticking, quiet, rhythmic, precise, from somewhere deeper in the flat. The ticking does not come from the mantel clock. That one is slow, its chime off by nearly a minute, its pendulum sluggish, nor from the pocket watch resting beside a violin case, the watch long unwound, its glass chipped at the edge. No, this ticking is lighter, cleaner, closer to breath than to time. One might notice it best when the fire crackles low. When Holmes is still, he sits in his armchair, not quite at rest, but not quite at work either. The violin untouched beside him, his fingertips steepled, eyes closed. His coat is hung across the back of the chair. A single curl of smoke rises from his extinguished pipe. Somewhere beyond the lamplight, a different world exists. Not the rush of investigations or cab chases or courtroom testimonies, but something quieter, something kept behind the curtain of daily chaos. And it begins, perhaps, with the watchmaker's window. You remember the way to his shop, down Bell Row and behind the Old Mews, where the stones darken earlier than the rest of the city, and the awnings lean low. It is not a place for spectacle. Most would pass it by entirely, but there it rests, a narrow storefront, glass cloudy with age, its name etched in faded gold, Cheathwaite, horologist. Even now, the display never changes. There are no grand clocks or elaborate automata, just a modest velvet cloth and navy, 3 pocket watches lying open as if mid-conversation, and on a worn wooden riser in the corner, a single magnifying glass held aloft by a brass stand. Dust gathers near the edges, but never on the pieces themselves. Each watch ticks softly, each one slightly out of sync with the others. They form a kind of music if you pause long enough to hear it. Inside, the shop smells of old leather, brass, polish, and varnished oak. The light is soft and amber, filtered through green glass panels set in the high windows. No bell rings at the door. No clerk appears. Just the sound of measured time, like raindrops on hollow wood dot. It's in that atmosphere. Measured, meticulous, that Holmes first came here, long before he met Watson. You remember the quiet reverence with which he observed the layout, not as a customer nor as a client, as an observer of patterns, as someone listening for the internal structure of the world. Dot in one of the side cabinets. Behind warped glass rests a timepiece unlike the others. Flat, round, housed in dark walnut. Its hands move backwards, counterclockwise, with a soft, insistent tick. Holmes watched it for 10 full minutes without speaking. A reminder, he said finally, that not all truths progress. Forward, he never bought a watch from Thwaite, never requested a repair, but once a month, without fail, he would come. Step inside. Walk once around the perimeter, listen, pause, then leave again. Thwaite himself is almost never seen. Some say he's deaf. Others say he's blind. Some insist he hasn't aged in 40 years, that his voice is like clockwork, literal clockwork. Holmes never speculated aloud, though once, after returning from the shop in silence, he did murmur, he keeps better time than London. On stormy evenings like this one, the watchmaker's window fogs from the inside. The watches keep ticking. A faint golden glow lingers just past the frosted pane, as if someone inside is still working under a low lamp, hunched over a mechanism with jeweler's tools and long patience. Back at Baker Street, the fire sighs. Holmes does not move. Rain trails down the glass in winding paths, catching reflections from the gaslights outside. A gust of wind rattles the eaves. Somewhere, a door creaks faintly, perhaps upstairs, perhaps in memory dot and from the far corner of the flat, where the rain is loudest and the ticking quietest. There comes the scent of something unexpected, a trace of varnish, brass polish, and the peculiar warmth of watch oil. The scent lingers longer than expected. It does not belong to the flat. Mrs. Hudson hasn't dusted the corners near the window in days, and Holmes has not had cause to use his tool set, not for repairs at least. Yet there it is, faint, familiar, unmistakable. The delicate sting of brass polish, the rounded sweetness of aged wood. A note of something chemical, clean, and ancient. Like memory sealed beneath glass. You remember the first time Holmes brought the scent home. It had clung to the sleeve of his coat, the gray tweed one, the one with the dark elbow patches worn smooth by habit. He had spent the afternoon alone, and when he returned, the scent accompanied him like a ghost. He offered no explanation, only poured tea in measured silence, lifted the violin without warming up, and began to play in a key so slow and so low that even the floorboards seemed to hum in response. Later, when Watson asked where he had been, Holmes answered only, listening. It was not evasive, not secretive, just enough. That's the thing about time, as Holmes often said. It resists narration. It moves whether or not one names it, whether or not one solves it. Now, as the rain persists outside and Holmes remains motionless by the hearth, a rhythm emerges. Not from speech or action, but from atmosphere, a tempo of silence and repetition. The fire exhales, the street lamp flickers, and beneath it all, the ticking continues. The shop on Bell Row has no listed hours, no posted days of closure. Yet somehow, it is always open when Holmes arrives. And somehow, it is always empty, save for Thwaite. You've never heard his full name spoken. In old records, the kind Holmes leafs through in searching the city's quieter layers, his signature appears only as G. Thwaite written, with a fountain pen and an angular, backward slanting hand. He does not greet customers, but he does nod, very slightly, when Holmes enters. A tilt of the chin, almost imperceptible, as though resetting an internal dial. The interior of the shop does not change. The walls remain lined with wood-paneled drawers. The workbench stays covered in velvet. Even the specks of dust seem to settle in the same pattern, time and time again. There are things in the shop that do not belong to the present. An astrolabe that maps stars long fallen. A second hand that loops an 11-hour cycle instead of 12. A musical box that plays only the same two notes over and over, a breath apart. Each item functions. Each is meticulously cared for, but none are for sale. None are labeled. They are fragments, Holmes once said, of time's private workshop. Not everything inside the watchmaker's domain takes up the same pace. Holmes seems to understand this intuitively. He does not speak in the shop, nor does he touch anything, but he observes with a kind of quiet reverence. His gaze traces the arc of suspended pendulums, the friction of gears turning under domed glass, the hush of a feather duster moving across an antique faceplate. Once he stood before the back wall for nearly 20 minutes. There, behind a locked glass case, sits a timepiece unlike the others, a mantel clock of dark stone, cracked at the base, its hands both missing. Instead of numbers, the dial is marked by 12 symbols, none of which appear in any modern almanac. When asked about it later, Holmes said only, "It keeps the time of a silence no longer observed." The words did not make sense. Not logically, but they matched the mood. And in Holmes' world, mood was sometimes the deeper truth. There are theories. Of course, Watson once mused, half serious, half hypnotized by the slow pace of Holmes' recital, that Thwaites' shop exists slightly outside of chronological order, that those who enter bring time with them like mist on their boots, disturbing the equilibrium, that Holmes, being more clock than man in certain moods, disrupts the least. Mrs. Hudson dismisses this naturally. It's a clock shop, she says. It smells like a clock shop. And your Mr. Holmes enjoys the smell? But even she hesitates when the scent appears in rooms Holmes has not entered. Even she pauses when the ticking returns in moments when no watch is wound. Tonight, as the fire crackles low and the windows fog from within, you might notice something unusual in Holmes' stillness. He is not merely resting. His head tilts, only slightly toward the far wall, as though listening, not to the room nor to the rain, but to something internal, something remembered. His fingers, lightly steepled, twitch once, then settle again, and from beneath the sofa, long pushed back against the wall, rarely disturbed, comes the faintest glint of brass. It was not there this morning. No footsteps entered, no visitors called. And yet there it is, a pocket watch, closed, resting in the dustless space beneath the sofa edge. Its surface is scratched. Its chain is short. There is no maker's mark. Holmes does not retrieve it. He only opens his eyes, slow and deliberate, and says into the silence, 7 beats, then pause, 3, then 4. Out of rhythm, but not broken. It is not addressed to you. Not directly. But the room seems to receive the words like a tuning fork takes sound, resonating slightly, imperceptibly through old wood and glass. Outside, the rain eases to a whisper. Inside, the ticking continues, not louder, not faster, just steady, and the scent of varnish, of oil, of something just beyond naming, settles deeper into the room, like memory winding down. Later in the night, when the rain has softened to a fine mist and the last of the coals glow faintly behind the grate, something in the atmosphere shifts. The street outside Baker Street lies empty, no cabs, no footsteps. Even the city's usual rustling distant. Voices, rattling shutters, the scrape of boots on pavement seems suspended. It is a London paused. A London between ticks. The fire gives a final crackle, then falls still. The scent remains faint, persistent, almost woven into the fibers of the rug. Brass and polish, ink and time. The pocket watch remains on the floor, untouched. It does not tick. Its face is closed. The chain curls in a loop beside it, and no movement stirs the casing. It waits, perhaps not to be picked up, but to be noticed. Not by the hand, but by the attention. Holmes has not spoken again. His eyes have returned to stillness, that distant, stormless blue that seems always to be searching something inward. The violin remains unopened in its case, and no paper litters the desk. It is not the quiet of boredom, nor of sleep. It is the quiet of a mind aligning with something vast and precise, something neither urgent nor explainable. A kind of reverence, as though observing the workings of a cathedral clock, too large to be seen all at once. You remember what he once told Watson? Late one night after a case, a night very much like this one, in fact, the fire had gone cold, the windows steamed, and Watson had asked lightly, curiously, why Holmes had never kept a timepiece of his own. Holmes had leaned back, one hand on the armrest, the other pressed lightly to his temple. Because I prefer to be reminded that time does not belong to me, he said. Only moments do. And even those pass whether I mark them or not. If it sounded at the time like a philosophy. But now, in the hush of this hour, it sounds like something else, an agreement. An understanding reached between a man and the rhythm that carries him. The pocket watch beneath the sofa still does not tick dot, but if one were to open it, just in theory, just in wondering, the inside would reveal not the usual numerals, but something stranger. 12 small brass symbols, each etched not with numbers, but with lines, tally marks, 3 and 4, curved and straight, some crossed through. They look more like notes than time dot, and in the center, no hands at all dot, just a hollow, where once. The hands must have turned, but now only absence remains dot, it is not broken. Holmes would know if it were broken. He has repaired things more delicate than time, if only for the satisfaction of seeing their design unfold. But this watch has not been dropped or worn out. It has been emptied, returned to stillness, not by neglect, but by intention. Room holds its breath. There's a notion Holmes mentioned once, when studying the pulse of a metronome found in a locked room murder, a rare moment when rhythm itself held the key. He said, a pattern is not only what repeats, it's also what is omitted, the silence between strikes, the pause before the echo. And here, in the quiet of Baker Street, that principle seems to rise around you like mist. Perhaps Thwaite never built timepieces to measure time. Perhaps he built them to listen to it, and perhaps Holmes is not drawn to them for their accuracy, but for the rare sensation that something within them listens back. You might notice now, very faintly, that the ticking has not stopped, not entirely dot. It comes not from the mantel, not from the forgotten watch in the corner, but from elsewhere, from within the flat itself. A rhythm felt more than heard. A slow, deliberate beat. 1, 2, pause. 1, a pattern that doesn't count time but suggests it. And when Holmes finally stands, slow, unrushed, as though responding to a cue only he can detect, it's not with urgency. It's with understanding. He walks once around the room. His gaze lingers at the fogged window, the street lamp beyond now softened to a blur, then to the chair, then to the sofa's edge. But he does not pick up the watch. Instead, he retrieves a single slip of paper from the mantel drawer, no writing on it, no stamp, no seal. Just a blank rectangle, slightly yellowed, folded once down the center dot. He places it gently beside the watch, as if completing a thought not meant to be written, then returns to his chair dot as he settles once more into stillness. The rhythm recedes, the flat breathes again, the coal's glow fades to shadow. A scent of polish begins to vanish, replaced once more by the ordinary notes of ash. Dust and faint tobacco dot outside. The rain resumes dot soft as before. Perhaps softer. Somewhere, far off, a distant bell chimes the hour, or almost does. Its tone wavers slightly, not quite in harmony, as though it too is listening for a pattern it cannot name dot, and in the window of G. Thwaite, horologist. If one were to pass by Bell Road just now, the watches would still be ticking. Slightly out of sync, quiet, steady, waiting. There's a corner of the city that few recall after dusk, a wedge of quiet between shuttered banks and silent counting houses, where the cobblestones are worn smooth by careful boots and the street lamps glow with a strange, almost deliberate patience. Threadneedle Street by night is not like the rest of London dot by day. It thrums with ledgers and telegrams, the shuffle of clerks, and the clipped voices of gentlemen who wear time in their pockets. Like obligation. But after business hours, when the last brass door is drawn shut and the gas lamps hiss to life, the street empties. It sheds its urgency like a snakeskin and settles into something older even than finance. The buildings are tall here and close together. They lean slightly, stone and soot giving way to moss in the mortar. Their windows are dark now, though behind some, one might glimpse the faint outline of rows, books, perhaps, or ledgers long out of date. On one sill, a glass ink bottle remains, half full. On another, a tin of biscuits forgotten since spring dot at this hour. The only figure moving is the lamplighter. You observe him from a distance, your vantage high and still, as though watching from an upstairs window that no longer belongs to a particular building, but to memory itself. His shape moves through the mist with the familiarity of ritual, the latter balanced across one shoulder, his silhouette long and slow, made indistinct by fog. He stops every 12 paces, not more, not less. A pause, a reach. A spark from the taper-thin light, warm, pale amber light. Not harsh like electric bulbs, not showy like chandeliers. Just a gentle glow that seems to bloom rather than ignite. The lamplighter's coat is long, wool, the edges dark with mist. His hat is broad, brim turned down. No one knows his name. Or if they do not use it. He is known only by his rhythm. Always the same hour. Always the same path. One lamp after another, like punctuation marks in the fog. Holmes once timed his route. He did not watch him out of suspicion. Far from it. He watched as one might listen to a clock whose workings are more beautiful than necessary. A creature of discipline, Holmes had said. Far more elegant than our so-called precision instruments. That was years ago. Holmes no longer times the lamplighter. But when the evenings grow long and the mists low to the ground, he sometimes sits by the window in silence, eyes following a path that leads not to the man, but to the memory of his passage. There is no urgency to the work. The lamps are not in disrepair. They do not flicker wildly, nor do they need coaxing, yet the lamplighter treats each one as a singular event. A conversation. His gloved hand touches the post briefly, just once, before lifting the taper. A gesture subtle. It might be missed entirely, not a greeting. More like acknowledgement. As though the post itself remembers him, you recall the sounds of the moment, the soft hiss of gas releasing, the whisper of flame catching, the quiet creak of leather boots pivoting against wet stone. And always the space between. It's the spaces that Holmes loved best. The stretch of quiet between the lights, between the rituals. The way the glow seemed to linger in the mist long after the man had gone. As though the street itself had sighed. Threadneedle Street is lined with more lamps than necessary. Some say it's a holdover from before the city reorganized its lighting routes. Others say it's because of an old fire, long forgotten, when this district was plunged into darkness and vowed never to repeat the sin of neglect. Holmes had his own theory that the extra lamps marked not danger, but memory. Places remember. Being seen, he said once. They glow longer where they were once needed most. No one ever speaks to the lamplighter. Not for a lack of curiosity. Simply because there is no opening. His route does not allow for pause. His presence feels sealed, like a parcel unopened. A letter sent from the past to no one in particular. You might notice, if you look carefully, that the lamps he lights glow slightly differently than the rest. Not brighter, never brighter, but steadier. Their flame seems less affected by wind. Their glow reaches a little further, fading not to black, but to soft gradients of silver and shadow, as though his light is not only gas and wick, but memory. Holmes once followed him, not closely and not to interrupt, merely to observe. He described it later, notebook open on his knee, as a ceremony without audience. The lamplighter walked the circuit from Lombard to Bartholomew Lane, then turned left into Token House Yard, where no lamps are needed. There he vanished, not abruptly, not magically, but with the slow assurance of someone returning somewhere familiar. The fog simply took him. The next night, he was back again. Same hour. Same steps, and still no one knows where he begins or where he ends. Tonight, in the comfort of the armchair at Baker Street, the same one from which so many puzzles have been pondered, Holmes sits with eyes closed, His fingers rest against one another, unmoving, but his posture tilts ever so slightly toward the north window. Toward the city, you can almost hear it, the soft strike of boots on stone, the brief hush of taper to lamp. Somewhere out there, a ritual continues, and even though the fog is too thick now to see the glow, it's there, a light not lit by flame alone, by the time the city clocks strike 9. The mist has thickened to a veil. Threadneedle Street disappears into layers, not of darkness, but of softness. Light scatters like memory across the cobblestones, and the glow of the gas lamps blurs into halos. In that quiet expanse, the lamplighter continues his work, each motion as familiar as breath. You observe him now not from the windows of Baker Street, but from a distance more intangible, a kind of recollection suspended in amber. The perspective is still yours, but it drifts. It weaves through air soaked with coal smoke and winter damp, gliding past eaves and empty carriages and into a space between now and once. The lamplighter pauses before a crooked post just outside an old exchange. The building behind it is shuttered, its signage long faded. A plaque above the arch bears a coat of arms rubbed smooth by time. The windows reflect nothing, only pale suggestions of the street behind. He lights this lamp more slowly than the others, not from hesitation, from care, the kind of unhurried reverence one uses when turning the page of a letter written in fading ink. There's a story to this particular lamp. Holmes told it once, without names, without dates, only images. A man waited here long ago, coat buttoned too tightly, gloves clenched. The light hadn't yet been lit. He paced, then stopped. Then waited again. Something had been promised, or postponed, or lost. Holmes couldn't say which. He only knew that for 7 nights, that man returned to the same spot. And on the 8th, the lamp was finally lit, though no one had seen. The lamplighter arrived. That was years before Holmes noticed the route. Somehow, the story feels part of the circuit now, as if the lamp itself had absorbed it, and the lamplighter honors it still. One begins to wonder, is the route chosen for efficiency or for memory? The lamplighter moves on. You notice, with a quiet sort of awe, that he never looks up. Not at the sky, not at the windows above, not at the lamps themselves. His eyes remain fixed slightly ahead and down, tracing the next step. His taper never falters. His hand never shakes. Holmes once described him as a man unbound by the need to arrive. He doesn't chase time. He fulfills it. He carries something forward not because it must be delivered, but because it was once promised, long ago. Perhaps. To no one still living. There's something else Holmes once said, late at night after a long spell without conversation. You remember it not as words on the page, but as a murmur into the dim. He had been watching the fog gather above the rooftops, violin untouched beside him. Some men investigate mysteries, he said. Others tend to them. He never clarified what he meant. But his tone was softer than usual, not melancholy, reflective. As though referring to a calling higher than deduction. The lamplighter steps now into Bartholomew Lane, where the lamps curve toward the old bank steps. Here the buildings rise taller, darker, echoes deepen. Even the mist sounds heavier between. These stones, he lights one, then another, then pauses. For the briefest moment, his head tilts. Just slightly, a deviation so small one might call it a trick of the fog. But it is real. You see it, a moment of stillness within stillness. The kind Holmes would never miss. The lamplighter reaches into his coat, not hurriedly, not with surprise. Just a simple practice movement. From an inner pocket, he removes a slip of paper. It is not unfolded. It bears no writing that can be seen. He simply places it very gently on the base of the lamp's iron post. It adheres there, held by nothing visible, not tucked or wedged. Just resting Dot, then he moves on. The next lamp flickers slightly before it catches. A breeze stirs from the east, catching the tail of the lamplighter's coat. And then he turns the corner, disappearing into Token House Yard once more, that narrow path where no light is needed. Back at Baker Street, the fire has been reduced to pale coals. Holmes still sits by the window. The fog is so thick now that even the lamps across the street are only suggestions of glow. The violin remains silent, the tea is cold. And yet, the room hums with the sense of something noticed, not explained, not solved, but held gently in the mind, like a feather balanced. On breath, you might sense it too, the way the evening seems to have shaped itself around a single presence. A figure of ritual, of purpose without announcement. Somewhere in the folds of Holmes's notebook lies a page marked only by symbols, half notes, lamplight timings, directions without addresses. There's no conclusion drawn, no theory, just a list. A route, a pattern. You suspect he is not analyzing it, not in the usual sense. He is remembering it, preserving it. Because in the world Holmes inhabits, not all puzzles cry out to be solved. Some, like the lamplighter's path, are solved already. Not with deduction, but with continuation. Not with explanation, but with endurance. And as the fog thickens again, you feel the city settle deeper into its silence. The lamps burn steady, worn behind their misty veils. No one speaks of the man who lights them. No one greets him. But in every street he passes, something glows a little longer. Not because of gas or wick, because he was there. The hours pass without protest. The fog remains, silver and thick, stretched between alleyways like a shroud carefully placed. The city sleeps. In layers now, not all at once, but by degrees, as if falling under a blanket of memory. Only the lamps remain lit, each one standing like a sentry in a world that does not ask for explanation, only attention. The lamplighter is gone. No footsteps echo now. No taper lifts in the darkness. His path has ended or faded or folded back into the city's older pulse. But the evidence of his passage remains, a series of quiet glows that trace a story no one tells aloud. You remember the way Holmes once walked that path, not at night, not during the lamplighter's rounds, but the morning after, a rare occasion. He rose early, before the fog had lifted, coat buttoned high, hat low. He said nothing to Watson. He did not bring a casebook. Only a pair of gloves and a quiet question in his expression. He followed the lamps in reverse, from Token House Yard to Bartholomew Lane, past the crooked post by the Exchange, and back toward Threadneedle. He did not touch anything. He did not stop. But every so often, he would pause at a post, just for a moment, and close his eyes, listening. When Watson asked later what he was hearing, Holmes replied, "Nothing," and that is the point. You understand it now, that nothing was not emptiness, but preservation. The silence left in the wake of something exact. A footfall, a light, a ritual. The sound of time being kept without asking to be counted. In the soft corner of the morning, the streets glistened with dew. The lamps were still lit, and as the sun began its slow, half-hearted climb behind the city's rooftops, one could almost believe the glow came from within the stones themselves, as if the lamplighter had coaxed something eternal from the ground upward. Holmes returned from that walk without commentary. Only a faint trace of mist on his shoulders and a slip of paper in his hand, blank, folded once, marked by a corner crease. It matched the one the lamplighter had left by the iron post. Holmes placed it in a drawer beside no other documents. He never spoke of it again, but from that day on, he kept a small taper stick in the desk, not for lighting, but for memory. Back in the present, or whatever time this feels to be, the lamps remain lit. You see them not from one window now, but many. as though drifting through the city itself, carried by a memory rather than a body. The lamps on Finch Lane, the twin posts along Princess Street, even the half-shaded one at the edge of Lothbury, the one with the cracked glass cover. Its glow imperfect, but no less steady. Each one holds its flame. Each one tells you something wordless. Holmes once mused that cities forget quickly, that steel replaces stone, and stone replaces earth, and earth forgets names faster than people do. But light remembers. It remembers the shape of a boot, the length of a pause, the way a hand hovers before it lifts. And Threadneedle Street remembers him, the man with the coat and the taper, the one who did not ask for attention, only trust. There are those who believe the lamplighter is a relic, a holdover from older times, preserved for tradition alone. Others believe he never existed at all, that his root is an inherited fiction, sustained by clerks and caretakers who do not wish to let go. But Holmes believed differently. It does not matter if he's real, he said once. He is present. That is more enduring than truth. You feel that presence now, not in sound or form, but in the way the lamps keep burning, in the way the fog parts slightly around them, as if reluctant to obscure their glow, in the quiet certainty that someone once passed this way and chose to leave light behind. The fire at Baker Street has long since faded, but the coals still whisper. Holmes has not spoken for some time, but his eyes are open, not focused, not scanning, just resting in the direction of the city, as if watching a route that no longer needs watching, as if knowing it will be kept, whether or not he's there to trace it. Outside, the lamps burn on, each one a soft note in a nocturne you can almost hum, each one marking the rhythm of a man who did not hurry, did not vanish, but simply continued, step after step, post after post, until the light no longer needed him to do so. The fog begins to thin. The first birds do not sing yet, but the darkness has grown quieter, a sign that morning is listening, even if it has not yet arrived. And in the stillness, something remains, not a mystery, a memory. It begins, as many quiet things do, with paper, not a new sheet, but one yellowed at the edges, creased neatly in quarters. Its surface bears the faint imprint of handwriting, not from ink, but from pressure, as if someone had written elsewhere atop it years ago and left a ghost of intention behind. Folded gently, sealed never with wax, but with care, the letter rests now inside the top drawer of Holmes's writing desk. The drawer is rarely opened. It is not where he keeps correspondence. That's in the cabinet near the fireplace, organized by category and country, labeled in his precise hand. The top drawer is different, less about record, more about recall. Tonight, the room is quieter than usual. Even the city seems hesitant. No carriages pass, no dogs bark. The only sound is the subtle rise and fall of Holmes's breath, his figure half shadowed by the low amber glow of the fire. The embers are steady, their warmth muted but persistent. The window fogs slowly. On the desk, beside a stack of unsharpened pencils and an unused blotter, the letter lies open now. The faintest curl at its edges betrays time. It has not been unfolded in months, perhaps years. There is no address. No name, only the whisper of graphite trails, faded cursive, interrupted here and there by the indentation of hesitation. A sentence began, then scratched out. A word repeated twice, as though emphasis might become truth. The tone is uncertain, not due to lack of thought, but abundance of it. You can almost feel the pauses between each line, long silences, as though the writer were listening to something unspeakable just beyond their reach. Holmes never explained where it came from. Watson asked once, gently, on a foggy December morning while clearing space for the Morning Post. Holmes only shook his head and murmured, "Some messages are made to arrive nowhere. It was not dismissive, it was protective, as though the letter held not information, but atmosphere, a delicate thread from the past that could not survive. Too much handling. You can see Holmes now, still seated in his armchair, the paper resting between his hands, but his eyes far away. Not focused on the words. Focused inward, tracing the paths behind them. The fire casts the slow-moving shadows across the carpet, catching the edges of the violin case and the worn corners of the Persian rug. There is a softness to the room tonight. It has settled into itself. Nothing sharp, nothing unfinished, only the letter. You imagine its origin. Perhaps it was written late, by candlelight, in a room heavy with winter silence. Perhaps the author paused often, not for want of words, but because each word weighed too much. The paper might have rested on a borrowed desk, or on a train compartment lap, or atop a shelf in a boarding house whose name no longer appears on maps. The ink is gone now, but the impressions remain. You can almost read it, not by sight, but by mood. I write you not because I expect an answer, but because I need the act of writing to recall your face. I have walked the square where we met twice now, but the benches have changed and so has the air. They say memory is a function of desire. I disagree. I remember you because something refuses to let go. Not love, not longing. A shape of you left behind and scent. And rhythm, and the way silence bends when I turn a page, and then it stops. No closing. No signature. Just the pressure of a hand that paused and folded the letter away before it was. Scent. Holmes does not revisit the drawer often, but when he does, the whole room seems to shift with him. Not toward sadness, not toward regret, toward awareness that some cases are made not of clues and motives, but of absences. That there are mysteries one does not solve, but tends to, like a garden left wild on purpose. Outside, the mist clings. To the windows. Inside, the letter breathes in the warmth of the room. It seems older than anything else here. Older than the Persian rug. Older than the cello leaning unused in the corner. Older than the first case Holmes ever took. Perhaps even older than Holmes himself, in a way that has nothing to do with age. Is something reverent about the way he folds the paper again. No sound, just motion. Precise, slow, certain, as if the act were not mechanical but ceremonial. He places it back into the drawer, not deeply, just beneath a worn envelope and a velvet ribbon, whose origin is never discussed. Then he closes the drawer, and the room becomes ordinary again. Almost. There is a silence that lingers after a drawer is closed. A particular kind of hush that follows the careful handling of something unspoken. Not final, not forgotten. Simply placed back where it lives best. Among other silences, the letter now rests once again beneath the surface of Baker Street, but its presence has not left the room. It clings to the air, to the quiet corners of the ceiling, to the faintest smells of paper, old ink, and the woody dust of time. Outside, the fog has thickened again. The lamplight beyond the window glows less like illumination and more like memory, caught behind layers of glass and mist. Holmes remains seated, posture relaxed, but not idle. His gaze has softened, not focused on the fire or the desk, but fixed inward, following a thread that does not need to be spoken aloud. It is not often that Holmes revisits the letter, and when he does, there is no case at hand. No client pacing the rug. No headlines in the Times to prod his attention. Only the slow hours when the house creaks, when the fire lowers, when the clatter of London fades to a distant pulse. Watson, long since retired to bed in these late-night stretches, once asked if the letter pertained to a case Holmes had failed to solve. Holmes did not answer. Instead, he turned to the window, his silhouette tall and lean in the candlelight, and said, "Some things are solved not by logic, but by being left alone." The letter, Watson concluded, was not a clue. It was a remnant, and perhaps more than that, a kind of tuning fork, resonating not with fact, but with feeling, with the shape of something that had once been real, even if unspoken. You remember, or imagine the possible author, someone thoughtful, not timid. The writing hand was not weak. It bore weight, pressure, an edge of certainty, but the certainty was not about being heard. It was about needing to speak into the space left behind by someone's absence. Perhaps Holmes knew them. Perhaps not in the ordinary sense. Perhaps the knowing was like the knowing of weather, something sensed before it is seen. You recall another evening, months ago, when Holmes stood before the bookshelves, not selecting a title but brushing dust from the edges. His hand had paused at one particular volume, a small leather-bound notebook that bore no label. It had not been opened in years, but that night he took it down, turned 2 pages, then returned it to the shelf. Untouched. He did not explain, but the rhythm matched tonight, a quiet circling, as if preparing a space for something to return. Unsent letter, though silent, seems to shape Holmes's thoughts like a slow tide, not erasing his sharpness, never that, but softening it. His movements become smaller, his breath shallower, as if he were listening to a conversation long since paused. There was a time when Holmes dealt exclusively in deduction, in the sculptures, concrete, the provable, the seen. But as years pressed on and nights like this one grew more frequent, a new mode emerged. Observation not of evidence, but of residue, of what's left when words fail, of what a hand says when it stops writing. Letter, or rather the absence of its destination, fits into that shift. Not a failure to send, not a refusal, but a recognition that some words are not for arrival, only for release. You imagine the place it might have been written, a railway station perhaps, waiting for a train that never came, a rain-wet room above, a tobacconist where the candle flickered in the breeze from a cracked window. Or maybe it was written on Baker Street itself, in this very room, though not by Holmes. There are moments when Holmes looks at the door as if remembering someone who once stood there, not to knock, but simply to decide whether to enter. Has a way of stilling when such thoughts come, not dramatically, not with melancholy. Just a hush like one does before opening a letter they already know by heart. There's a theory Watson once held, though he never committed it to writing, that Holmes had once loved. Not with flowers or proclamations, Holmes would never engage in sentimentality, but with precision, with silence, with presence. And that love, whatever its shape, had not ended. It had simply moved elsewhere, into letters unsent, into notebooks unopened, into the drawer where silence is kept like a relic. The fire cracks once, the room responds in texture, not in sound. A slight shift of shadow on the rug, a flutter of warmth against the glass. You notice these things not as action, but as evidence. Small confirmations that something here is still listening. On the writing desk, the ink bottle remains capped, the blotter unstained, the paper stack undisturbed. Holmes has not written in some time. And yet the space remains ready. The tools clean, the air clear, as though waiting still for something that might not return, but is honored just the same. From beyond the window, the night deepens. Carriage wheel turns somewhere out of sight. A footstep echoes near the curb, then fades, but the lamplight holds steady. The room breathes in rhythm. And in the drawer, folded, untouched, the letter waits, not for an answer, not for a sender, only to be remembered. There is a peace that settles over Baker Street in the hours just before dawn, a kind of invisible velvet, drawn gently across the city's shoulders. The fire has dwindled now to a soft glow beneath the iron grate, and the window pane hums faintly with the press of early chill. Holmes has not moved in some time. He sits, as he often does in these rare, wordless hours, with his hands loosely folded, and his gaze turned not outward but downward, as if looking at something not visible to the eye. The armchair cradles him without weight. The shadows from the bookshelf rise behind him like remembered. Thoughts. The drawer remains closed. The letter within has returned to its quiet place beneath the paper and ribbon. But its presence still lingers, like the final note of a sonata. Long since played, not forgotten, not even remembered. Simply known. You might feel it now, the shift in the room. Not dramatic, not cold, but inward, like a breath drawn deeply and held. The air carries no scent of tobacco tonight. No ink. No open case files or chemical trails. Only the faint warmth of paper and wood, and the stillness that surrounds something left untouched. Holmes once said, not in passing, not in jest, but with full sincerity, that some truths do not wish to be found out at the time. Watson had furrowed his brow, ready to challenge the statement, but Holmes held up a hand, gentle but firm, and added, because their value lies in their being sought, not in their being solved. And the letter, folded once, sealed never, addressed to no one, may be such a truth. Perhaps it was written by someone Holmes once met only once. A quiet conversation on a foggy platform. A fleeting word shared across a dim corridor. Perhaps it was never meant for him at all, only found by him, tucked inside a returned book, or slipped beneath a door with no sender in sight, or perhaps it was his own. Watson never dared ask, not truly, because there was a dignity in the not knowing, a respect for something not meant to be dissected. Holmes, who so often unraveled the world with threads of logic and shadow, had left this thread tied in a bow, deliberately. You imagine the contents now, not in words, but in sensations, a pause between lines, a moment when the pen hovers, a phrase scratched out, then written again more softly. There is emotion, but not drama. There is care, but not plea. It is not a love letter, nor a farewell. It is the record of presence, the quiet anchoring of someone to someone else. Long after the moment has passed, even unsent, it carried purpose. Holmes did not need to mail it. The act of folding it, preserving it, placing it in the drawer, these were its destination. In his silence tonight, you sense a kind of reverence, not grief, not longing, but attention, a most precise and delicate form of respect Holmes knows. He has given entire hours to the study of fingerprints, pipe ash, the torn edge of a stamp. But this small nameless paper he attends to with, the quiet of memory. Eventually, he stands, not abruptly. No code is fetched, no case begins. Only a quiet shift in posture, a tilt of the head. His footfalls are soft across the carpet as he crosses to the window. Outside, dawn does not yet break, but something approaches it, a thinning of shadow, a gentling of sky. The kind of prelate that doesn't seek attention but prepares the world to receive it. Holmes rests a hand on the window ledge, fingers against the glass, and exhales. You might imagine the condensation there as a single breath's worth of writing, an invisible message, seen only until it fades. Then he returns to his chair. The violin remains in its case. The desk untouched, the drawer closed. But something has shifted all the same, not in what has changed, but in what has been acknowledged. He leans back, not asleep, not alert. Simply present, and around him, the quiet hum of Baker Street resumes, pipes settling in the walls, a distant clatter of milk carts beyond the lane, the gentle tick of a clock whose face is turned toward the room rather than the wall. The letter will not be sent, but it will remain. It will be folded again. Sometime later, by the same hands, with the same care. It will continue to carry something. Not news, not feeling, but a rhythm of thought that finds no other vessel. And in that rhythm, Holmes seems content to rest. The morning has not yet declared itself. London remains wrapped in its woolen hush, caught between the soft blue of Perdon and the first amber hint of gas lamps being extinguished for the day. Covent Garden Market, usually a riot of carts and shouted names in rustling crates, lies dormant under the weight of stillness. You find yourself remembering the way it looks before the stirrings begin. The cobblestones are damp, recently swept by fog and the slow drip of rooftop condensation. Crates of celery and soft apples rust in stacked corners, their wooden slats dark with dew. The gaslights that hang from the wrought iron arches still glow faintly, their light diffused into the moisture-heavy air like lanterns underwater. But what draws you tonight, or this morning, or this drifting in between, is not the market itself, but the sound beneath it. Holmes first noted it during a winter month without a case, when the world offered neither crime nor call. He had been passing the garden alone at an hour much like this one, not by design. Simply walking, coat collar turned up, hands in his pockets, eyes not looking for clues but listening. It was then he heard it. A tone, faint, low, pulsing through the stone. Not music exactly, but not mere noise either. A resonance. As if something old and thoughtful moved beneath the market's foundation, playing notes only the pavement could understand. Holmes, naturally, returned the next morning. Then again the morning after that. No tools. No maps, no need for Watson. He brought only his boots, his stillness, and his willingness to listen for things others walked past. It is not the underground, he remarked later, reclining with his eyes closed. Hands tented in his lap. Nor the drains, nor the pulse of late trams. It is something deeper, something older than the city's engines. He would not call it a mystery, nor did he chase it as he would a case. He simply attended it. There are old tunnels beneath Covent Garden, some known, some guessed at, leftover arteries from an earlier London, when monks moved in silence and candlelight, and coal wagons rolled on grooved iron long before passengers filled the platforms. These tunnels shift, collapse, reform, some believe. They breathe. Some say the sound Holmes heard was the air itself, remembering its shape. You hear it too now. Not a hum, not a thrum, but a tone, round, deliberate, buried deep in stone, not loud, not persistent, but there under everything. Like a cello note held beneath silence. It does not ask to be followed. It only asks to be felt. The traders will arrive. Soon, their boots will scatter the quiet. Their voices will stretch wide across the square, filling it with stories of spoiled potatoes, with the clatter of coin and the rustle of newsprint under fruit. But not yet. Now, the market belongs to the sound, out to the soft echoes of past mornings, to the faint scent of parsley and ash, to the cobblestones slick with last night's fog, and to the singular presence of Holmes, who once stood in the middle of this space, just here, beside the iron pillar, with his eyes closed and his ear turned not to wind, but to stone. It is said he murmured something then, not a solution, not an insight, a name, a single name, spoken as if an answer to a question only he had heard. The name is lost now. No one else was near, but he spoke it with the tone one uses for music remembered rather than understood. And then he left, quietly, without commentary, without the desire to solve. Later that day, he sketched a circle in the margin of his notebook. Not a clue, just a shape, I think, he said. It's not a message, but a memory. Of what? He did not say. And the tone beneath Covent Garden plays on, not always, not predictably, but when the air is damp and the stones are still, and the city forgets to move. By now, the sky has begun to pale, not brightly, not with fanfare, but with the careful quiet of a page being turned. The lamps around Covent Garden dim in sympathy, their glow softening into the mist like words losing their ink. But the sound beneath the square remains, not constant, not mechanical, but present. It emerges from beneath the stones, not as vibration, but as suggestion, a low note that does not disturb the air, yet becomes impossible to unhear once noticed. Holmes once described it as a tone carried not by ears, but by thought. The market is still empty. The traders have not yet arrived. A lone broom leans against a post, forgotten. A small puddle reflects the sky's slow awakening. A pigeon, half asleep on a ledge, stirs but does not take flight. This is the hour Holmes preferred, when time had not yet chosen a direction. When echoes were longer than footsteps. On one of his quieter days, Holmes brought nothing but a folded scrap of paper and a tuning fork. He stepped into the center of the square, just beside the drain cover that often goes unnoticed between two flagstones. And there he struck the fork, gently, deliberately, against the heel of his boot. It rang high, clean, sharp. Then faded. But Holmes stood still, waiting. And then it returned. Not the fork's note, not exactly, but something deeper. A resonance that answered it. Not an echo, but an agreement. He knelt down then, not to investigate, but to listen more closely. One ear turned toward the ground, not touching it, just nearer, as if the stones beneath were singing a chord only he could decipher. He said nothing that day, but later, back at Baker Street, he copied something into the margin of his commonplace book, a series of small circles, each ringed with a faint mark. No words, no conclusions, just the soft pattern of someone listening. Watson had watched from the sitting room as Holmes made the sketch. He asked if Holmes thought there was something beneath the square, some hidden machine, or ancient mechanism, or a lost crypt. But Holmes shook his head. No, he said. Nothing new, nothing hidden. Only something waiting to be remembered. It did not sound like metaphor. It sounded like fact. There are rumors, of course, as there always are in places where history and silence overlap. Some claim Covent Garden was built atop a meeting place of bells long removed. Others speak of an underground chamber used by musicians who played in secret during the Great Fire, their harmonies drifting upward to soothe the burning city. Still others whisper of a Roman floor, tiled with bronze and stone, built to resonate, with footsteps in a way that would keep time without a clock. Holmes entertained none of these directly, but he listened to them. That was his way. You begin to feel now what he must have felt, that the sound was never meant to be understood, only acknowledged. You drift further into the square, the memory widening. There, beside the produce stand, long covered now in tarpaulin, is the place Holmes once traced a chalk ring. He returned to it twice, each time marking another circle within the last. By the third visit, the weather had washed it clean, but he didn't redraw it. He only stood a few paces farther back and murmured, "The center moves." What that meant, no one knew, but it matched the tone, shifting, ungraspable, never quite where it had been the moment before. Later, in the rooms of Baker Street, Holmes took to playing a particular note on the violin, low, drawn out, held with extraordinary control. The sound would hang in the air like fog, never quite resolving. Watson once noted that it matched the precise frequency of the morning air beneath Covent Garden. He measured it with a tuning device, nodding to himself. Holmes said nothing, only played the note again, this time more softly. One evening, while reading in the armchair, Holmes paused mid-sentence and looked up. The fire was low, the windows fogged. The letter from Story 3 still resting in the drawer. "Do you ever wonder," he said slowly, "if the city remembers more than we do?" Watson looked up from his book. "In what sense?" "In the way stone remembers footsteps, or air remembers a song. Not what was done, but that it was done." Watson said nothing. But the silence that followed carried the weight of agreement. Back beneath Covent Garden, the sound remains still faint, still ancient, still shaped not by melody, but by presence. The market will wake soon. Boots will stamp. Barrows will rattle. The echo will fade. But for now, Holmes's memory holds Dot, and through that memory, so does yours. Dawn comes without announcement. Not in gold or fire, but in silver. A slow tide of light that seeps between bricks softens the iron beams and rests gently on the damp cobblestones of Covent Garden. The market is stirring now. Not fully, just the first notes of motion, the creak of a cartwheel, the rustle of canvas, the distant clink of tin, but beneath it all, the sound is still there, quieter now. Or perhaps simply deeper, pressed farther down beneath the days, gathering rhythm. Holmes once said that it was not erased by noise, merely overlaid, that it never disappears, only recedes, waiting to return when the world forgets its hurry. He understood this not as theory, but as rhythm. He had walked the market a dozen times without speaking, moving from stone to stone as if tracing a forgotten tune, each step chosen, each pause intentional. He wore no disguise, no notebook in hand, only his usual coat, his long stride, and that expression of listening usually reserved for windless rooms and late-night deductions. You remember the last time he returned from the square. It had rained that morning, not heavily, but enough to leave his cuffs damp and the soles of his boots slick with grit. He had not spoken when he stepped through the door. He had only removed his coat, placed it on the hook with care, and turned to the fireplace where the kettle had just begun to hum. Holmes had stood there for a long time, hand resting on the mantel, as if letting the sound warm him. Then, without looking up, he had said, "It has changed key." Watson, reading by the window, looked over his spectacles. The sound? Holmes nodded, a minor third lower than before. Unless certain, like it's remembering something it had forgotten. There had been no case attached to it, no crime to unravel. But Holmes had recorded the detail all the same, as he would a shift in scent, or the appearance of a single new coal smudge on a client's cuff, because to him, the city was a living manuscript, not to be read linearly, but listened to, with care across time. Now, in the rising morning, the tone has nearly faded. The vendors arrive. One by one, their carts roll across the square. Crates are opened, bananas lowered from trucks, ropes untied with the sleepy slap of canvas, boots strike the stone. The day begins, but somewhere beneath it, faint but true, the tone still murmurs. And without needing to see, that Holmes hears it too. At Baker Street, the windows begin to brighten. The frost along the sill thins. The violin rests quietly in its case. The letter in the drawer remains unopened, untouched, unchanged. Holmes sits in his chair, not facing the fire now, but turned slightly toward the morning. He is still not idle, not in thought, simply listening. There is a soft rhythm in the way he holds his breath, a musicality in the angle of his hand upon the armrest. He is not waiting for a message, nor expecting a resolution. He is honoring a note, the sound beneath. Covent Garden is not a question. It is not a riddle. It is a trace of what once passed there, of what was once heard, of what, in some soft, ungraspable way, remains. Holmes would never say it aloud. But you feel the shape of the thought behind his silence. Some truths are not to be solved, only heard, only remembered, only carried gently like a song that has no end. The square bustles now. Children run past with bread in hand. A dog barks twice and vanishes into the alleys. Shouting begins, playful, urgent, alive, but beneath it, for those who know how to listen, the tone remains. Deep in the stones, low in the air. A breath of music folded into the city's slow heartbeat, and for Holmes, that is enough. There is a calm that settles over Hampstead Heath at first light, a kind of green silence woven from leaf and dew and the distant murmur of waking birds. The grass holds a coolness that lingers even in summer, and the trees stand like tall, slow witnesses to whatever the day may bring. And just beyond the path where the ground curves toward the rise, there is a small wooden cottage with ivy growing thick around its eaves. The bees are already awake. Their sound is not sharp, not buzzing in any frantic sense. It is soft, the hum of focus, of instinct, the low resonance of purpose carried on wings. You find yourself drawn toward the source, not through curiosity, but through atmosphere. The air here is different, thicker with the scent of pollen and damp bark, sweeter with the musk of clover and cedar. The path narrows, the grass rises to meet the knees, and there, tucked beside an old stone wall and a crooked row of white birch, is the APIARY dot. It is modest, just 3 hives. Their boxes stained with time and sun, resting atop stones to keep them clear of the earth. No signs mark this space. No tools lie strewn about. It feels less like a place of work and more like a space tended with ritual, a garden not cultivated for yield, but for rhythm. Holmes first came here years ago, not as detective, not as legend, just as a man in need of silence. It was after one of the long winters, after a case that did not close, and a letter that never came, and a month in which even the violin would not speak. He had walked the heath without direction, following nothing more than the wind's suggestion until the hum found him. He did not approach at first. He sat at a distance beneath a linden tree and listened. The beekeeper had not seen him, or if he had, he did not interrupt. He moved slowly between the hives, his figure wrapped in linen, gloved and veiled, though not always. At times he worked bareheaded, as though the bees recognized him, or had simply forgotten to fear him. It is said, though Holmes never confirmed, that the man never spoke, not because he could not, because he didn't need to. Communicated through gesture, through presence, through the patience of still hands and unhurried breath. Holmes began to visit once a week. He did not announce himself. He brought nothing. He sat at a respectful distance, never closer than the shade beneath the linden, and listened. Not to the man, not even to the bees, but to the space between them. The hives thrived, even in colder months, when frost rimmed. The grass and the flowers withered to memory. The hum remained, softer, deeper, like sound folded into earth. Holmes once likened it to the sound beneath Covent Garden, a tone that does not need to be played to be real. He never asked the man's name, never traced the cottage, never sought the beekeeper beyond that clearing, because some presences, Holmes believed, were not meant to be known by name, but by ritual. There is a chair there now, not under the linden, but near the wall where the ground is firm and dry. A simple wooden thing, unadorned, weathered. It appeared some weeks after Holmes's first visit. He never sat in it, but its presence was a kind of acknowledgement, a nod between two men who shared an understanding, however quiet, however wordless. In time, Holmes brought a notebook. He did not write observations, not facts, not even sketches. Only circles, small, overlapping, drawn with a charcoal pencil in the corners of the pages. Sometimes he would pause for long stretches between lines. Other times he would draw 3 at once, then close the book as if to preserve the silence that came after. Watson, when he learned of the Heath visits, did not press. He knew that Holmes carried weights not always visible, and that the man who sought answers in ashen thread and print also needed places where no answers were required. The apiary became that place, a space outside the city, outside time, outside reason. The bees worked. The wind passed through the grass in waves. The linden tree dropped its leaves slowly, and Holmes, seated just beyond the wall, listened Dot and perhaps for a few hours at a time, remembered how to be still. The weather shifts gently as the sun rises. Over the heath, pale light dapples through birch branches, and the breeze begins to stir more earnestly, carrying with it a scent that is neither floral nor wild, but specific: warmed wood, fresh wax, a whisper of lavender. Holmes is already there. He has arrived without sound, as always. No carriage, no cane, no disturbance in the grass that would mark his approach. He sits on the low stone wall beside the apiary, legs crossed, notebook balanced on one knee, closed. His eyes do not follow the beekeeper. They rest somewhere beyond. The hives, perhaps on the fields, or the wind, or a thought held quietly within. The beekeeper moves between the hives with the slow precision of one long practiced in listening. There is no rush. No tools clang against the frames. He lifts a box lid and pauses, as if to allow the bees time to prepare. Then gently tilts a slat outward, examines it, returns it. A murmur rises from the cluster, not alarm, only acknowledgement. It is a working song, low and steady. The rhythm of unseen labor. Holmes once described the sound as a city beneath itself, not in the metaphorical sense, but in the structural. A society with its own laws, unseen yet absolute. He did not romanticize it, nor did he reduce it. He respected it. It is a system without waste, he once said to Watson, and without need of explanation. The bees do not theorize, they do not guess, they act. And yet they create something enduring. It was the closest Watson had heard Holmes come to admiration without irony. This morning, Holmes does not write. He has not written here in weeks. The notebook remains in his lap, unmarked. Not for lack of thought, but because some patterns no longer require recording. They become memory by repetition. The beekeeper moves toward the far hive now, the third in the row. The one with the slightly darker wood and the corner repaired by hand. He does not open it. He rests one hand lightly on the top, just for a moment, then moves on. Holmes notices. His head tilts slightly, the way it does when he follows a new thread in the middle of an old thought. But he does not speak, does not move. His breathing remains even, quiet, as though aligning with the hive's own rhythm. You feel it too now. The weight of stillness here is not passive. It is chosen, deliberate. Each moment stretches not, because it is slow, but because it is full. This is not where Holmes solves problems. It is where he lets them rest. You remember a passage Watson once read aloud from a book left half open near the hearth. It spoke of places of low noise where the mind resets its compass. At the time, Holmes had not responded. But later that evening, he folded a page in his notebook and drew a hexagon. He said nothing, but a week later, he returned to the heath. The bees continue their work. Above the hives, the air shimmers faintly with movement, not chaotic, not unpredictable, but alive. The sound is constant, yet never monotone. It fluctuates with weather, with season, with mood. Holmes could sometimes distinguish between the tones, knew which pitch suggested a queen in motion, which a shift in the brood, which meant the honey was heavy enough to collect. But he never intruded. He never collected. Once, the beekeeper offered him a jar sealed with wax, the label blank. Holmes did not refuse. He took it with both hands, bowed slightly, not deeply, not theatrically, but enough. Then turned back toward the wall, the jar held in his lap like a keepsake. He never opened it. Instead, it remained on the mantel at Baker Street, beside a magnifying glass and a railway timetable long out of date. The honey inside darkened over. Time thickened. Settled. Watson noticed it once while dusting when asked about it. Holmes only said, "It reminds me that there are things still working while we sleep." The bees do not pause, even as clouds roll softly across the sky and the trees begin to rustle more urgently. Their hum continues, a conversation too low for human speech, but full of purpose. Holmes closes his eyes, not to sleep, not to dream, but to align. You sense it now, that this place, this moment, is not about what is being done. It is about what is allowed to be. Holmes is not here to gather, to understand, to resolve. He is here to remember that the world carries on with, or without him, and in that remembering, something within him rests. Later in the day, after the light has shifted and the morning has burned quietly into early afternoon, the bees begin to move more slowly. Their song softens, no less purposeful, but toned now with warmth. The hives radiate gently in the sun. The fields beyond the apiary ripple with late summer wind, tall grasses nodding like drowsy sentinels. The trees hold their silence without strain. Even the clouds seem to drift with intention, long and soft as breath. Holmes remains at the stone wall, his coat is folded beside him. The notebook is now open, but still unwritten. The charcoal rests in the crease of the binding, untouched. His eyes are not closed, but half lowered, the gaze of a man not looking at anything, yet seeing everything. The beekeeper has gone inside. Suddenly, not mysteriously, just gone, a door creaked open. A shadow moved across the window, and the space around the hives returned to stillness. Yet nothing feels abandoned. Everything continues. The bees hum, the birch trees sway. Holmes listens. And beside him, on the wall, something small and unexpected has been placed. A square of cloth, folded once, clean. On top of it, a single sprig of lavender. Not for function, for presence, a gesture of recognition. The sort that asks for no reply. Holmes notices, of course, but he does not reach for it. He lets it remain, a symbol untouched. His hand rests gently beside it, fingers lax. The breeze lifts one corner of the cloth, then lays it down again. You remember now something Holmes once said, in a moment of rare transparency, spoken not to Watson, but to no one in particular, as if thinking aloud before sleep. Some lives are not measured by their events, he murmured, but by their repetitions. Watson had asked him then if he meant ritual. Holmes had simply nodded. In this place, this hour, this rhythm of bees and breath and silence, this is ritual in its purest form. Not ceremony. Continuance. Holmes breathes in deeply. And the scent of the heath surrounds him, earth and linden bark. Faint smoke from some unseen cottage. The subtle sharpness of wax. All of it grounds him, not as detective, not as mind, but as man. He has not spoken for hours, yet something in the shape of the moment says what words would not serve. The beekeeper will return tomorrow, or the next day. He will tend the hives. Holmes will sit at the stone wall, and nothing will be exchanged except the constancy of being there. That Holmes knows is enough. The notebook may never be filled. The charcoal may remain blunt at the tip, but none of that matters. The real record is here, in sound and space and memory, in the hum that continues, even when he is gone. Eventually, Holmes will rise, not abruptly, not with finality. He will stand as the shadow of the wall begins to lengthen, gather his coat, and press the notebook close with care. He will glance once more at the hives, then turn toward the path that leads gently away from the clearing, through the birch, and back into the world that waits. But for now, he remains listening. Still. A line. There is a narrow street just off. Fitzroy Square, tucked between two shuttered tailor shops and a once greengrocer now dusted in soot. It is the sort of street most forget, not from neglect, but from design. Its name, barely legible on the leaning signpost, is inked in letters faded by rain and chimney smoke. Whitlow Lane. The cobblestones here are uneven. The gas lamps burn a little weaker. Even the air carries the hush of things left unsaid. But in the center of the row stands a modest window, always half fogged, framed by curling woodwork and pale curtains that never quite draw closed. And behind the glass, always, rests a violin. It is not a shop. There's no sign, no hours posted, no name etched in gold leaf. Just the window, the curtain, and the violin. The instrument is not displayed exactly. It is placed carefully, with reverence. The light catches it differently each day, sometimes across the strings, sometimes along the carved scroll at the neck. Sometimes it is barely visible at all, tucked behind the veil of the curtain, waiting. Holmes first noticed it during a walk late in autumn. He had been returning from an evening meeting, one of those rare, wordless excursions when the case was less pressing than the fog was thick. The lamplight caught the edge of the glass as he passed, and something, not sound but memory, stopped him. He turned back, and there it was, a full-size violin. Dark wood, slightly bowed bridge. Rosin dust settled gently beneath the strings. No bow in sight, no stand. Just the instrument, resting on its side upon a folded velvet cloth. Holmes stood there for some time. He did not press closer to the glass, did not shield the reflection with his hand. He simply observed the curve of the instrument, the tone of the varnish, the faint suggestion of usage in the soft edge of the chin wrist. He returned the next day. And again the next. There was never anyone at the window, no movement behind the curtain, no indication of change. Yet each day the violin had shifted ever so slightly, once by a few inches, once with the tailpiece turned more toward the light, once with a single string gently unwound, loose and curling. The changes were not decorative. They were intentional. Holmes called it a correspondence in silence. He never asked Watson to accompany him. This was not a case. It was not a puzzle. It was something quieter, a ritual not to be disrupted. On mornings when he returned from the heath, or evenings when the fog was too heavy for deduction, he would pass by the window and pause. Sometimes he carried his own violin, and sometimes, rarely but reverently, he would take it out, step just beyond the frame of the window, and play. Only a note, or two, a fragment. The sort of phrase one hums not to perform, but to remember. Then he would move on, never waiting for a response, never expecting one, but always knowing the window would be there the next day, and the violin within it, altered. Again, there were moments when he seemed unsure whether the instrument belonged to someone at all. It may not be owned, he said once, watching the soft reflection in the glass. It may simply be kept, as one keeps memory, or grief, or joy. You begin to understand now what drew him back to it. The violin in the window did not speak, but it listened. Its presence was not passive, but attentive. A constant note held across the stretch of unmeasured days. And for Holmes, who so often walked the line between brilliance and solitude, that listening mattered. He never spoke of it outside the lane. The notebook contains only one entry related to Whitlow Lane. A small sketch of a violin resting horizontally on a blank field with a single word below it answered. The window never opened, the curtain never lifted, but the conversation continued across days, across glances, across the subtle shifting of presence. And Holmes, for all his certainty and silence, seemed soothed by the knowing that somewhere, not far from Baker Street, a violin waited each day for nothing but to be seen. The days passed, and Whitlow Lane remained unchanged in the way only the quietest places can, not untouched, but undisturbed. Leaves collected along the edge of the curb. The gas lamp at the far end began to flicker in the early evenings. The lace curtain in the window thinned just slightly, as if the light behind it were growing more tired, and still, the violin remained, Each time Holmes passed the lane, the instrument had shifted, never dramatically, never showily, but enough to be certain it had not been left. It was tended. A new fold in the cloth beneath it, a faint gleam where dust had been gently wiped away. Once, a single note was found, hand-penned in the corner of the glass, not on the inside, not from the owner, but traced faintly into from the outside. A clef. Nothing more. Holmes stood for nearly an hour that morning, hands clasped behind. His back, the cold biting through his cuffs. He did not speak. He did not play. He did not touch the window. He only tilted his head, as if listening for something he was not quite ready to receive. Back at Baker Street that night, he did not read, nor did he take to the violin. He sat in the chair by the fire, eyes half-lidded, lost in a stillness that even Watson did not interrupt. After some time, Holmes murmured, "It is a message without urgency." Watson looked up. The violin. Holmes nodded, almost imperceptibly. It changes because it chooses to, not because it must. There's something comforting in that. He never elaborated. But over the weeks that followed, his pattern became clear. On mornings that began too early or nights that ended too late, Holmes would pass Whitlow Lane again, sometimes with purpose, sometimes without. Each time he paused before the window. And each time, the violin greeted him in a new pose. One evening, a string had been removed. Not broken, removed. The peg turned slightly. The string coiled into a loose spiral beside the instrument, like a soft, sleeping question. Holmes did not appear troubled. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. Inside, a scrap of parchment. And on the parchment, written in Holmes's sharp hand, were 4 notes, a motif. A phrase not of resolution, but of rest. He placed it not on the window, but in the crook of the brick ledge beneath, then walked on. Next day, the string was restrung, tighter than before, tuned, perhaps, to a slightly sharper pitch, and the scroll of the violin now faced the left, as if looking down the lane. Toward the place, Holmes always vanished beyond the second lamppost. There was no reply. Not in the conventional sense, but something in the gesture, the turning, the string, the way the cloth had been refolded, spoke of receipt, of response. Of acknowledgement. Holmes smiled only once in reference to the window. A true, brief smile, not of amusement, but of resonance. Watson had asked without pressing what the appeal was. Holmes had replied simply, "It listens." And Watson, for once, did not question further, because he understood. Holmes, whose days were filled with noise, with deception and distraction, deduction and interruption, had found a kind of silence that answered back. Not with words, not even with notes, but with presence. And the violin, in all its shifting, was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a companionship to be felt. You see it now. The way Holmes stood a little straighter when he approached the lane. The quiet reverence in the turn of his hand as he removed his gloves, even when he did not stay long. The rhythm of his steps slowing, just before the window came into view. It was a ritual. A conversation. A mirror. One day, the curtain was drawn more than usual. Only a sliver of the violin was visible, the edge of its body, a curl of wood, the faintest glint of its polished back. Holmes stood, as always, before it, and though nothing could be seen, he remained, not to look. To be looked back upon. The final visit came quietly. There was no sign of it being final. No storm, no sudden note left behind. No dramatic change in the violin's placement. Just the steady, calm accumulation of days, and then, one morning, the window was empty. Holmes arrived early, the mist still holding to the corners of Whitlow Lane. His coat bore the scent of rain, and his gloves, though dry, had softened from wear. He stepped to the curb across from the window, as he had done countless times before, and with nothing. The curtains were drawn. No violin, no cloth. No trace of dust or rosin, no silhouette behind the glass. The space was clean, not abandoned, cared for. Clear. Holmes did not move for several minutes. He stood without expression, the brim of his hat tipped slightly forward. His breath, visible in the morning air, formed small, regular clouds. Then he blinked once, slowly, and stepped forward. The ledge beneath the window remained, as always, narrow, brick-framed, weather-worn. On it, folded carefully in half, was a single piece of paper. Holmes looked down at it. He did not reach immediately. Instead, he traced its edges with his eyes, as if measuring the silence it had waded through. Then, without ceremony, he picked it up. The paper bore no letter, no name, no instructions or farewell, only 4 notes, drawn in black ink, the same motif Holmes had left weeks earlier, transcribed now with greater care, as though rewritten not to repeat, but to return. Below the notes, one word, heard. Holmes closed the paper and held it in his palm for a long time, not pocketing it, not reading it again, just letting it rest there, warmed by his touch. He did not need more. This was not a mystery, not a game. It had never been about meaning. It had been about attention, about 2 people, or perhaps only presences, witnessing something quiet together. In the weeks that followed, Holmes did not speak of the violin. The paper disappeared into the pages of his commonplace book, not marked, not labeled, simply pressed between the leaves like a fallen petal. Occasionally, he would open the notebook late at night and let his hand rest on that page. Not to read, not to study, just to remember the rhythm of the silence it carried. Watson noticed a change in Holmes in the days after. Not a transformation, but a softening. He spent more time with the violin, not practicing, not performing, just drawing slow, long tones, the kind that hover between sorrow and stillness. He never passed Whitlow Lane again, not because he had lost interest, because the conversation had ended with dignity, with grace, with something Holmes rarely received in his world of chaos and calculation, a farewell without the sting of absence. The window remained empty. The curtain, sometimes ajar, revealed only the inside of a clean, quiet room. Once, Watson walked the lane and paused there himself. He saw nothing unusual, just the way the light rested on the glass, soft and golden, as if remembering something recently gone. Back at Baker Street, the violin waited on its stand. Sometimes, late at night, Holmes would lift the bow, strike a single note, low, resonant, clean, and let it stretch into the quiet until it vanished, not to summon, not to mourn, to acknowledge, because some presences in life do not fade. They conclude, and their conclusion is not an absence. It is a final chord still vibrating in the air long after the music has stopped. The platforms at Charing Cross have always carried a kind of residue, not grime or soot, but memory. The kind that lingers in the scent of old ticket stubs, ink-stamped schedules, and the faint perfume of coal-laced fog drifting along the rafters. The station breathes in its own rhythm, slow, mechanical, solemn. Not with the urgency of departure, but with the quiet weight of waiting. It is here, along platform 4, tucked just beyond the main staircase where the shadows collect. Beneath the iron latticework, that an umbrella leans. It has been there for as long as Holmes has known the station. Longer, perhaps. Always propped in the same place, near the second bench from the wall, close to the edge of the platform, but never quite tipping over. Black, wooden handle. The kind of umbrella that was made to last, not to impress. Its fabric remains intact, its ferrule clean. Never dusty, never moved. Holmes noticed it years ago. Not immediately, but gradually. The way one begins to notice the tick of a clock, not by its volume, but by its insistence. Every time he passed through Charing Cross, whether on a case or returning from the Strand, the umbrella was there, rain or shine. Morning or dusk, always alone. No one seemed to claim it. No one seemed to remove it. It was not tied to a notice board. It bore no label, and yet it remained unclaimed, untouched, entirely ordinary in appearance, yet impossibly constant. Holmes naturally began to watch it, not out of suspicion, out of curiosity. He understood better than anyone the logic of things left behind. And this umbrella, unlike so many forgotten items, was not discarded. It was kept, maintained. It existed not by accident, but by intent. He once stood beside it for 20 minutes, pretending to read a timetable, noting who glanced, who didn't. No one paid it mind. The constables walked past it. The porters worked around it. Even the pigeons, ordinarily greedy for anything out of place, avoided it. That night, he returned home and wrote a single line in the margin of his casebook, unclaimed, therefore remembered. Watson assumed the umbrella was a quirk, another of Holmes's endless fascinations with the overlooked. But there was something different about this one. Holmes did not speak of it often. He did not theorize. He did not place bets or make predictions. He simply visited it from time to time, without schedule, without reason. Once, on a day when no trains ran, a rail strike, the platform empty but for wind and one sleeping porter, Holmes stood beside the umbrella for the better part of an hour. He did not sit. He did not speak. He stood, waiting for nothing. The umbrella did not move, but the silence between them did. Holmes later called it a placeholder for a conversation left unfinished. Was it left by someone? Perhaps. Forgotten by none, but claimed by no one. Was it a meeting place? A token of return? Or perhaps simply a symbol, something immovable, held in stasis by memory alone? He never solved it. He never wished to. There are mysteries that resist solving not because they are complex, but because they are complete, closed loops of presence and absence. And in the umbrella's quiet, persistent residence, Holmes seemed to find peace. You remember how he would sometimes adjust his stride as he approached platform 4, not slowing, but aligning, so that his footfalls would match the rhythm of the station's breath, so that when he paused beside the second bench, the umbrella and he shared a silence neither had disturbed. He never touched it, never even reached. The space between them was respected, maintained, a stillness within the rush of travelers and suitcases. And boots and coal the umbrella remained and Holmes. Though he moved on, always carried a sliver of its stillness with him, like the feeling of a familiar chord struck softly in a long-forgotten song. Afternoons at Charing Cross tend to blur. Voices overlap. Boots echo down corridors and station. Agents speak in practiced tones that carry across stone and soot. Trains arrive and depart like breath, deep, rhythmic, unnoticed unless withheld. But in the middle of it all, between arrivals and farewells, the umbrella remains always at the edge of platform 4, always still. Holmes once said, "Some objects are not forgotten, they're remembered differently." He did not mean sentimentally. The umbrella was not adorned. It bore no initials, no ribbon, no gesture of affection. It was not part of a mystery that needed solving, but it remained mysterious because it persisted. Not through attention, but through absence. You recall the day Holmes lingered longer than usual. It was raining then. Not heavily, a steady, tired sort of rain that seemed more like memory than weather. The trains were delayed. The lights flickered above the platform. And still, the umbrella stood where it always had, dry despite the mist. Holmes stepped beside it and did not look directly at it. Instead, he turned his gaze outward, to the edge of the tracks, to the tunnel mouth yawning. Darkly in the distance, He stood there as if expecting something, or remembering something. After a time, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small envelope, unsealed, folded only once. He did not open it. He did not read it. He simply held it in his gloved hand, beside the umbrella, but not touching it, like one might hold a letter near a grave, not to deliver, but to place, or to understand. Then, gently, Holmes turned the envelope over and slid it back into his pocket. He said nothing, but in his silence was the weight of decision, the understanding that some messages are not meant to be left behind. Only carried Dot later that evening, Holmes stood at the window of Baker Street, watching the fog collect on the glass. The kettle had gone cold. The fire burned low. Watson asked if he'd found what he was looking for. Holmes did not turn. He answered with a quiet certainty, "No, but I found what remained." And that, perhaps, was more important, you might think. The umbrella changed over time, but at DIDN single quotes T. It was never newer, never older. It never fell, never shifted, never tilted in wind. It did not collect litter. It simply existed, quietly, steadily, as if holding space for something that could not be named. Holmes once noted that memory is most precise, where it meets routine. That is what the umbrella was. Not a symbol, not a relic, but a location. A routine emotion, a pause, a placeholder. A question whose answer was never urgent. There are stories whispered by the station staff. Some say the umbrella belonged to a porter who never returned from war. Others claim it marks the last place. A message was meant to be passed, a letter lost in transit. A few believe it's part of an agreement, one Holmes made in the shadows with someone never seen. Holmes himself offered no theory. He refused to fictionalize it. He only returned, again and again, to bear witness. And over time, Watson understood that it was not the object Holmes came to see, but the space around it, the silence it held. The attention it invited. It became a measure of something Holmes rarely acknowledged aloud. Not loneliness, not loss, but the constancy of a thing. Left carefully, quietly, without explanation, and never retrieved, the world shifted around it. Trains sped faster. Lights grew harsher. Signs were changed and routes revised. But the umbrella stood. And Holmes, whenever he stood beside it, seemed to shift into a quieter shape, not smaller, but softer, more precise, more human. You imagine now what it must have felt like to pause beside it one final time, knowing it might not be there tomorrow, or perhaps knowing it always would be, but differently. Not an object, but an habit. In the simple act of looking for it. There came a day when Holmes arrived at platform 4 and the umbrella was gone. Not shifted, not fallen. Gone. It was late in the morning, just past the quietest hour of the day, that brief spell after the early commuter rush, before the midday trains filled with school children and errand runners. The station hummed with its usual rhythm. Porters called names. Papers rustled. The soft thunder of footfalls filled the vaulted air. And yet the space beside the second bench was empty. Holmes stood there longer than usual. No surprise showed in his expression. No worry, only stillness. He scanned the area once, not quickly, not obsessively. Just one long, slow sweep of the eyes across brick and steel and shadow. Then his gaze returned to the place where the umbrella had always rested. He did not speak, did not ask, did not search. Instead, he lowered himself slowly onto the bench, the very bench it had leaned beside all those years, and sat. From his coat pocket he withdrew nothing. From his casebook he removed nothing. He simply folded his hands together, placed them lightly in his lap, and looked down the line as if watching the memory of a train pass through. Watson would later describe this moment, not from observation, but from Holmes's recounting, as a silence unbroken not by the world, but by the self. because Holmes did not break it. He allowed the emptiness beside him to remain empty. And in that emptiness, something softened. You can imagine the texture of that pause, the way the sounds of the station bent around. It muffled and respectful, the way the light fell precisely across the edge of the bench, illuminating only the shadow where the umbrella had once stood. The absence was not sharp, not sudden. It was gentle. Like a candle extinguished by breath, Holmes remained seated for 10 minutes, or perhaps longer. Time does not keep well in moments such as this. Eventually he stood, not with finality, but with calm, and before he turned to go, he reached into his coat and placed a small, folded object on the bench beside him, an envelope. Identical in size and weight to the one he had once considered leaving behind, he did not open it. He did not glance back. He left it there not as a message, but as a mirror, as something to hold the silence a little longer, to answer not what had been lost, but what had remained. He never returned to Platform 4 again, not for reluctance, not from sorrow, because the moment had been honored. The pause had been shared, and the ritual, that quiet arc of presence and memory, had reached its final measure. Back at Baker Street, the entry in Holmes's notebook read only, "Space kept is space remembered." In the weeks that followed, Holmes seemed no different. You, who have watched closely, who have seen him in those hours between dusk and midnight, would notice it, a new pacing of silence. A slightly longer pause before the first note of his violin. A subtle shift in the way. He folded his coat over the back of his chair. There was no melancholy, only reverence. And when Watson asked, once gently, if he missed the umbrella, Holmes replied, "I miss knowing that it waited." There are objects that outlive purpose, but this was not one of them. This was an anchor, not to a person or to a place, but to a feeling. To the comfort that something, somewhere, did not change. Until it did, and even in its absence, that comfort lingered. You can still imagine it. Now, the shape of the umbrella leaning patiently in its place, the light catching the curve of its handle, the faint impression of a presence beside it, not forgotten, not explained. Only known, there is a chair by the fire at Simpson single quotes, stash in dash, the dash strand. Not in the main dining hall, with its polished cloches, clatter of silver, and the quiet murmur of conversations held behind cravats, but in the smaller room just off the side corridor, where the wainscoting is darker, the air more fragrant with old wood and pipe smoke, and time moves with a quieter gait. The room is not advertised. It is not reserved. It simply exists, like a passage tucked behind a thought, or the memory of a name never quite forgotten. And within it, beside a hearth that never fully cools, is the chair. Holmes discovered it years ago, not during an investigation, nor in the company of clients or curious aristocrats, but on a rainy afternoon, when the streets of London had lost their edge, and the cases had grown quiet, and the city seemed to exhale without asking anything in return. He stepped in, more for dryness than destination, and found the room waiting. Fire had already been lit. The chair, deep-backed, mahogany-stained, upholstered in green, stood angled slightly toward the grate. Its arms bore the shine of habitual touch. Its legs rested unevenly on the wood floor, making the faintest creak when settled into, like a sigh too polite to disturb. Holmes took the seat, not in haste, not with analysis. He sat as though drawn, not by intention, but by alignment, and once seated, he remained. That first visit lasted nearly 2 hours. No one spoke to him, no waiter approached. The few other patrons in the room, older men in soft coats, a woman in a faded hat reading quietly over a glass of port, paid him no attention, as if the room itself knew how to keep silence where it belonged. From that day forward, Holmes returned, never on a schedule, never from necessity. But when the air felt a certain way, when Baker Street had grown too sharp, when the morning papers spoke too loudly, when he had just finished a case or just abandoned one, the chair became a ritual, not a retreat, but a recalibration. You remember it now, the way Holmes's frame would seem to soften as he sank into the cushions, his spine easing but never slouching, his fingers steepled not in calculation but in reflection. The firelight would catch along his cheekbone and vanish into the collar of his coat. The sounds of the outer dining hall, cutlery, coats, the shuffle of linen faded to distant harmony. He never read there, never wrote, rarely even spoke. Once, Watson joined him, only once. He had come upon Holmes already seated, his eyes half closed, the fire painting long amber shadows across his lap. Watson took the chair opposite and sat. Neither spoke dot when the hour passed. Holmes rose, nodded once, and left, and Watson later understood the fullness of that silence, that it had been an invitation, not for conversation, but for presence. There are few spaces Holmes respected as deeply. The chair by the fire was not just furniture, it was a threshold, a place where thought became distance, where noise gave way to breath, where memory could settle and dissolve without. Demand, he once called it, a listening post for the interior. You feel it now, even years later, the warmth of the hearth against your knees, the gentle protest of the wood beneath your weight, the stillness of being neither before nor after, but entirely within. The logs shift softly in the grate. Coat across Holmes's knees remains undisturbed, and in the quiet beyond the window, the city moves on, unhurried, unaware, unwatched for just a little while. Time behaves differently in the room with the fire, not slower, exactly. Not faster either, just deeper, as though it sinks a little more gently into the floorboards, as though the moments there are aged in oak and smoke before they're allowed to pass. Holmes sits in the chair, as he always does, with his hands resting lightly on the arms and his gaze unfixed, not on the fire, not on the shadows, but somewhere just beyond both. His breath is steady, his posture relaxed but upright, like a cello balance before the first stroke of the bow. No newspaper lies open, no cigar burns. No sound breaks the hush except the occasional pop of resin in the hearth and the delicate creak of leather as someone in the far corner crosses a leg. It is the kind of silence that listens back. The fire, though not newly lit, holds strong. Its glow casts a flickering warmth over the grain of the wooden panels and the brass fittings of the hearth tools. The flames dance low, like they've grown used to the quiet and do not wish to disturb it. Holmes does not require distraction here. In this room, in this chair, he does not calculate. He does not analyze. He reflects. You can almost feel it, the way his mind slows from its usual velocity, the way his thoughts drift from deductive clarity toward something quieter, less concerned with answer, more attuned to presence. On one rare occasion, Holmes entered the room with mud still caked at the edge of his trousers, the heel of his boot damp from some bog outside Finchley. His coat hung heavier than usual, a cold wind having wrapped itself around his shoulders all morning. But upon entering the side corridor of Simpson's, his step quieted, and his shoulders lowered, not with fatigue, but with familiarity. He did not brush off the mud. He did not adjust his cuffs. He walked directly to the chair and sat. The fire was already lit. It always seemed to be, as though someone or something knew how to keep time with Holmes's internal clock. No schedule, no routine, but a rhythm nonetheless. A conversation with no words. That day, Holmes remained seated for nearly an hour and a half. A waiter passed, offering tea. Holmes declined with a slight motion of the hand. Not impolite, simply unnecessary. As though refreshment here came from a different source altogether. Afterward, When Holmes returned to Baker Street, he said nothing of the visit. But Watson noticed the difference, a quiet to his movements, a grace to the way he handled the violin, drawing one long note out of the instrument as if tasting silence and sound. It was from that same visit. Watson later learned that Holmes made a rare addition to his private notes, a single sentence written in a small ledger he kept locked away in his desk. The fire speaks nothing, and in that nothing I understand everything I need. The chair itself is not remarkable. It has no engraving, no known downer. Its cushion is not especially plush. The arms bear small divots from time. The upholstery is threadbare along the edges where the elbow rests, and yet it remains unclaimed, always available when Holmes arrives, always waiting when he does not. Some say it is merely chance. Others believe it is courtesy, extended from the staff, an unspoken understanding that Mr. Holmes, though rarely identified aloud, is not to be disturbed. But Holmes himself believed something different. He believed the chair kept time, not time as the clocks did, not in hours or minutes, but in rhythm, in emotional tempo, in the quiet cadence of memory and need, in the things one does not ask for, but is nonetheless given. He once told Watson over an untouched supper, "There are places in London that don't mark the passage of time, they collect it," and the chair was one of them. Tonight, he sits once more. You watch the flames reflect along the sharp lines of his cheek. You feel the warmth of the hearth soften the creases of the day. Outside, the city hums, carriages pass, bells toll distantly. But here, inside the wood-paneled quiet, none of that reaches. The chair holds him not as possession, but as memory. Not as comfort, but as listening. And Holmes, who asks the world so many questions, lets this place be one that answers nothing, because in its silence, everything is already known. Evening deepens slowly within the room. The fire burns low now, no longer lively, but steady, holding close to its center, like a heart grown quieter with age. Its glow stretches across the floorboards and flickers gently against the lower walls, where the polished wood darkens into shadow. Outside, the world dims behind the windows, but here, the stillness lingers like a breath held just before exhale. Holmes is not moved. He sits as he did when he arrived, posture calm, gaze slightly downturned, not in thought, not in waiting, simply being. His boots rest squarely on the floor. One hand is draped lightly across the chair arm, the other relaxed at the seam of his coat. A presence without demand. There is no timepiece in this room. No mantel clock. No ticking, no chiming. Time is felt here not in seconds, but in temperature, in the way the fire settles, in the softness of footsteps on old rugs, in the way Holmes rises, not suddenly, but with the inevitability of a page turned. When he does stand, the chair creaks softly in farewell. Holmes adjusts the line of his collar, then rests one hand briefly on the chair's back, not for balance, for acknowledgement. And then he steps away, not with haste, not with ceremony, but with reverence. He leaves nothing behind, takes nothing with him, and yet the room changes in his absence, as if it remembers, in some subtle way, that he was there. The air cools slightly. The flame pulls inward. The room exhales. The chair remains empty, but not vacant. Holmes never speaks of what he thinks about in that room, not to Watson, not even to himself. There are no deductions made, no conclusions drawn. But it is clear, unmistakably clear, that he leaves lighter than when he entered. Some silences are passive. This one is not. This silence holds. It listens. It restores. And Holmes, who carries the weight of other people's tragedies, of riddles no one else sees, of truths often best left hidden, he allows himself here to be unburdened, to leave something behind that cannot be spoken aloud, a kind of weariness, A kind of grace dot over the years, the chair sees others. Patrons come and go. But somehow, when Holmes returns, it is always there, waiting, unclaimed, offering no question, no welcome, only continuity. Once, after a particularly harrowing case, the kind Watson never fully wrote down, Holmes sat in the chair for almost 3 hours. No drink, no fire lit, just the dusk, and when he finally rose, he left a single match on the armrest, unstruck. Not a message, not a symbol, just a promise that silence would be honored. And returned to tonight, the fire goes out on its own. Number 110. The last curl of smoke vanishes into the chimney, and still, the chair holds its shaped dot. It will remain there tomorrow, and the day after. Whether Holmes returns or not, it will remain. A pause in the rush, a hearth beside the noise, a seat that asks for nothing but presence. At Baker Street, the windows flicker as another log settles into coals. Holmes removes his coat, places it carefully on the hook, and before turning in, he stands at the hearth in his own sitting room, fire low, shadows steady, and lets his fingers rest for just a moment on the arm of his own chair. It does not creak, but the silence feels the same. It rests in the front room of 221B Baker Street, tucked just behind the glass of the narrow sitting room window. The one on the left, the one that faces Baker Street, not directly, but slightly askew, as if watching the world go by through the corner of its eye. A watch chain, simple, gilded, coiled in a perfect half circle, like a quiet question, not prominently displayed, not announced. Just there, laid atop the narrow sill, its length precisely measured between two small bookends, a miniature bust of Aristotle and a smooth stone. Paperweight Holmes picked up once from the banks of the Seine and never spoke of again. The chain is old, not tarnished, not worn, but old in the way things are when they've passed through many hands without ever truly belonging to one. It does not hold a watch. It never has, and yet it remains. Watson once asked about it early on, when he had only just begun to notice the peculiar geography of Holmes's quiet rituals. The chain had caught the light one late afternoon, its reflection flickering against the ceiling like the movement of a distant lantern. Holmes had looked up from his writing and said, without hesitation, it belonged to no one, and yet it waited. Watson had smiled politely, assuming it was a deflection, but Holmes said no more. Over time, the chain became part of the furniture of the flat, not utilitarian, not decorative, but atmospheric. The way certain smells settle into old rugs, the way shadows collect near certain corners, it did not change. And Holmes never moved it. You see it now as the light shifts through the tall windows, the chain catching the fading sunlight of late afternoon. Outside, the clatter of hooves along Baker Street softens beneath the weight of evening. Mrs. Hudson has lit the lamp in the hallway, and the scent of coal smoke and fading rain curls gently into the corners of the room. The chain holds its shape. Are no fingerprints on the window, no marks on the sill, no dust around the chain's edge. Holmes sees to that. You begin to understand this is not ornament. It is a marker, not of time, but of attention. Holmes, who tracks movements through the residue of footprints and chimney ash, who dissects motive from phrasing and heartbeat and stillness, keeps this chain not as a clue, but as a constant, a tether to something unsaid. He once sat in silence by the window for over an hour, eyes not on the street, but on the glass, watching, perhaps not for anyone in particular, but for the feeling of arrival, the possibility of it, the space where it might exist. He never touches the chain during the day, but sometimes, in the quietest hours of the night, after the fire has died down and Watson's footsteps have long ceased above, Holmes will approach the sill, can almost hear it, the slow creak of the floorboards, the whisper of coat wool as he kneels, the soft metal-on-metal sound as he lifts the chain just briefly into his palm. He doesn't examine it, he doesn't weigh it. He simply holds it, and after a minute, never more, he places it back. Exactly as it was. Watson once described it in his notes, in a page never published, as a loop of gold too quiet to be missed, too familiar to be explained. Holmes never objected to the phrasing, because it was true. The chain in the window does not signify anything beyond itself. It simply remains. As some things do. It is raining now, the sort of rain that comes without wind, vertical, measured, soft as parchment. It draws long lines down the glass of the window, distorting the light from the gas lamps outside and casting faint, shifting gold across the sitting room floor. The watch chain does not move. It never does. And yet it reflects the weather more faithfully than any barometer. In fog, it dims. In sun, it warms. On days like today, it becomes a slender river of brass, collecting the slow light as it slips sideways into the room. Holmes is nearby, seated in his chair, facing the hearth but not the fire. There is no case on the table, no telegram waiting to be deciphered. His violin leans quietly in its cradle, untouched. His hands rest on the arms of the chair, long fingers still, index and middle barely pressed together in thought. He is not watching the chain, but his body faces it. You might think he is lost in analysis, but no. This is a different shape of stillness. This is not the quiet that precedes action. It is the quiet that follows remembering. The chain is not a relic. Holmes does not keep relics. He keeps rhythms. This chain, coiled as it always is between the philosopher's bust and the unnamed stone, marks not time, not ownership, but a return. It is a point to which his eyes and thoughts often drift. Not to decipher, but to align. Watson, years ago, had once lifted it, innocently, mindlessly, while dusting the sill in an absent-minded way. He had turned it over once in his hand, then twice, only to realize at the third turn that Holmes was watching him with an expression unlike any Watson had seen before. Not anger, not fear, something quieter. Like someone watching a photograph begin to fade. Watson set it down immediately. Holmes did not speak. The chain was adjusted, not abruptly, not possessively, just returned, precisely, the arc of its curve retraced. The space between it and the bust measured. Then nothing more was said. From that day on, Watson never touched it again. But he noticed how Holmes would, from time to time, glance toward it as he passed, not to check on it, not to protect it, but to confirm its place, the way one might look out over a familiar street before turning home. What the chain marked, Watson never asked. He guessed, as anyone would, a client, a memory, a loss. But Holmes once murmured quietly on a night of no wind and no flame, it was left not to be remembered, but so something would stay. He did not elaborate. But from the way his voice softened on the word stay, Watson understood. The chain was not evidence of an ending. It was the preservation of a middle, a held breath. A pause that had never released. That evening, Holmes had risen slowly from his chair, moved to the window, and stood beside the chain. He didn't reach for it, only let his fingers rest near it on the sill, as though warming his hand beside a familiar heat. Outside, a carriage passed. The shadows trembled across the ceiling. The room breathed in and out. Holmes spoke once more, to no one in particular. Some objects carry presence, not weight, not meaning, only the suggestion of someone. You might understand that now, the way certain objects live not in memory, but with it. How they do not ask to be seen, but simply remain, constant, quiet, unchanging. Today, As the rain falls and the coals in the hearth shift slightly inward, the chain holds its shape. Dust and the stone haven't moved. The light changes, the shadows lengthen, but the chain rests, a golden curve against glass and wood, watching the city go on. Not a relic, not a clue, a promise, perhaps, or a reply. Night has come softly. It arrives not with finality, but with a gradual lowering of the city's shoulders. The light fades first from the corners of the room, the bookshelves, the table legs, the folds of the curtain, until only the golden glow of the hearth and the soft gleam of the watch chain remain. Holmes stands at the window now. He is not silhouetted against it. The lamp at his side burns too low for that. Instead, he appears softened, more suggestion than figure. His coat drapes loosely across one arm. His hands are folded gently behind his back. His posture, for once, lacks its usual geometry. It has settled. The chain rests as always, still curved, still precise. But tonight, Holmes lifts it. Not fully. Just enough to allow it to rise into his palm like a weightless question. His thumb brushes lightly across the fine links, not to feel, but to listen. You can almost hear it, that faint, dry whisper of metal moving against skin. Not sound, but texture. He closes his fingers around it. And for a moment, the world narrows. No footsteps above from Watson. No rattle of wheels in the street. No clocks ticking. Only the hush of the window, the warmth of the fire, and the shape of something held long enough to mean what it never had to say. Holmes is not a man prone to reflection, at least not aloud. But here, in this quiet hour, you see the shape of thought move across his face. Not analysis, but memory. The kind of memory that doesn't carry words. Only weight and rhythm. He breathes once, slowly. Then, just as carefully, he places the chain back on the sill, exactly as it was. He adjusts the arc, straightens the space between it and the Aristotle bust, restores the invisible line of balance with the stone. It takes only seconds, but the care, the precision, the intention, they speak louder than any confession. This chain is not an object of sentiment. It is not an heirloom, not a token. It is a ritual, a shape Holmes returns to not out of grief, but out of respect. For something, for someone, for the moment in time when that chain came to rest where it does now, and was never asked to leave. It is a fixed point in a world he otherwise dissects, and because it remains unchanged. Holmes can. Once, when Watson lingered in the doorway late at night, he caught Holmes sitting at the window in the dark. The fire had gone out. The room was cool. The chain shimmered faintly in the blue light of the street lamps below. Holmes, unaware of being observed, leaned forward and rested his fingertips lightly against the glass, beside the chain, not upon it. And then, in the faintest of voices, he said, "Still here." Watson said nothing, turned away, because there are truths in Holmes that only emerge when the room has fallen completely still. Tonight, the fire dies to embers. The shadows rise slowly to meet the ceiling. Holmes turns from the window, retrieves a worn book from the shelf, not to read, but to hold, and sits by the hearth once more. The watch chain, left behind on the sill, reflects the dying light. It does not glint. It glows, and in that glow lives something unsolved, unchased, and wholly intentional. Not a deduction. Not a conclusion, a remembrance, a kindness. A silence kept. Baker Street, in the hush just after midnight, breathes differently. The gas lamps no longer flicker for attention. They hold their glow as if in conversation with the dark. The city has softened into itself. The distant rattle of a carriage wheel becomes rare, and the usual rhythm of footsteps gives way to silence thick enough to notice one's own breath. It is during this hour, when 221B grows quiet enough to hear the ticking of the hallway barometer, that the step at the base of the staircase reveals its secret once again. The third step from the bottom, slightly hollow, unremarkable in appearance. But if you place your foot just so and press with the full weight of your heel, a faint shift occurs, a creak unlike the others. Not louder, just dot, 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 different dot, and beneath it, kept within the subtle recess of age-softened wood, is a set of keys. Holmes never called it a hiding place. He never referred to the keys aloud, but they were always there, even before Watson knew to look, even before Mrs. Hudson swept beneath them with her unknowing broom, even before Holmes ever admitted that he had once, just once, lost something. The keys do not jingle. They do not shine. They rest wrapped in cloth, soft and waxed, the linen yellowed with time, the edges curled inward as if it had once been part of a pocket square, long retired dot. There are 5 of them dot, each different in shape, each older than the next, one as long, an iron forged, its grip twisted like a ribbon of smoke. Another is brass, narrow, worn smooth from use. A third is tiny, barely a key at all, delicate enough to have once opened a drawer or a locket. The fourth bears a mark, not a letter, but a symbol, a circle with a single line drawn through it. The fifth has no teeth at all. It is only suggestion, a blade of metal without purpose, or perhaps with a purpose Holmes never shared. Watson discovered them by accident, or rather, by following Holmes during one of those insomniac wanderings through the flat. Holmes had paced the floor 3 times, then descended the stairs barefoot, coat draped across his shoulders, eyes unfocused. Watson, curious but careful, kept a few paces behind, and there, in the stillness of the stairwell, he watched as Holmes pressed the edge of his heel to the third step. No flourish, no glance back, only a pause, a breath, and the quiet lift of a floorboard. Watson did not speak, and Holmes did not explain. Instead, he knelt, unwrapped the cloth, touched each key once with a single finger, not for function, not for need, then rewrapped them, replaced them, and stood. Watson returned to his room that night with more questions than answers, but he never asked, because something in Holmes's stillness had not invited inquiry. It had asked instead for preservation. The keys are not for unlocking cases. They do not lead to secret files or hidden vaults. Holmes has never used them to open any known door within the flat or beyond it. He has never labeled them. He has never spoken their origin, but he remembers them. He remembers their weight, their feel, their place in the cloth, the order in which they lie. And from time to time, always during the quietest part of the night, he retrieves them, not to use, to keep. You begin to understand. The keys are not for opening, they are for holding closed. Holmes, who deals in access and exposure and the breaking open of hidden truths, keeps these in silence. In the hollowness of a step no one watches, in the space between footfall and memory. And when he returns them with that same slow reverence, that gentle press of wood on wood, the stair creaks again, not louder, just differently. It's difficult to say when Holmes began the practice. Not the keeping of the keys, that part has no origin that Watson ever uncovered, but the quiet descent of the stairs in the middle of the night, the way he would leave his chair at the fire, set down his book or case notes, and vanish into the hush of the lower hall. Never with shoes, never with sound, just the faint press of fabric and bone upon wood, as though the house itself had grown, used to his movements and no longer protested them. Tonight, it's the same. The lamps upstairs have been lowered. The fire in the sitting room glows only at its core. Even the clock on the mantel ticks as if mindful of the hour. And through the stillness, Holmes moves down the staircase, across the landing, to the third step. You watch, not intrusively, but with the reverence one gives to a familiar ritual observed at a distance. He presses the edge of his foot, Gently against the stair's outer corner, there is the sound, that slight, soft give, the yielding of old timber, followed by the whisper of linen as the cloth bundle is withdrawn. Holmes kneels, though not fully. He crouches low, careful, not to disturb the balance of the moment. His fingers, long and precise, untie the cloth without haste. The keys glint in the dimness, not brightly, just enough to be seen. Holmes does not pick them up, not at first. He only unfolds them, laying them in a fan across the cloth as if greeting. Old acquaintances whose names need not be spoken, then one by one he touches them. Not for long. Not to examine. Just enough. The brass key with the smooth grip, the long one with the twisted stem, the delicate one barely more than a pen, the key with the circle and the line, and the last, the one with no teeth. Each receives the lightest. Passive as fingers. No expression crosses Holmes's face. No conclusion is drawn, but the silence around him deepens, not heavier but fuller, as if these objects, so inert to the world, possess the weight of kept memory. You sense, in Holmes, something rarely visible, not nostalgia, but recollection without attachment. These keys are not part of a case. They are not to be used or understood. They are evidence, not of crime, but of moments kept private. Doors once opened, rooms once left. People remembered not in photographs, but in metal and silence. Watson once asked, gently, if the keys were relics from a past too painful to name. Holmes had paused, not in discomfort, but in thought, and then replied, no, they are the shape of things I no longer carry, but still return to. It made little sense then, but you understand now. These are not tokens of loss. They are coordinates, anchors to certain moments, emotions once felt and set aside with care. The way one stores letters they will never read again, not for sorrow, but for the ritual of remembering. Holmes wraps the cloth again with careful hands, not from superstition, from precision. He refolds the corners, realigns the weight, replaces the bundle beneath the board, and lowers the step with the softest of presses. Then he remains. Not standing. Just still. As if listening, not for noise, but for balance. Eventually he rises, slowly, turns, ascends. The stair holds his. Secret once more, and all that remains is the faint memory of a creak. Morning arrives with its usual hush. The gray light of London pouring softly through the windows of 221B. The air is cool, washed in the scent of damp stone and coal smoke from the nearby chimneys. Outside, a milk cart rattles past. Inside, all is still. Holmes is already awake. He has been for some time, though not by design. Some mornings he rises because sleep has ended, others because stillness has called him forward. Today it is the latter, downstairs. The third step remains undisturbed, but Holmes does not press it this morning. He walks past, eyes brushing the stair as one might glance at an old friend across the street, not with expectation, but with acknowledgement. The keys are already remembered. He settles into the chair by the hearth, book in hand, but not opened. The fire, newly lit, begins to crackle. The violin rests nearby, untouched. And as the warmth spreads, Holmes leans back, one arm resting lightly along the chair's edge. You feel it, the way the silence wraps around him like an old coat, familiar, weighted in the right places. He once told Watson, not long after a case involving a set of missing correspondence, most things are not truly lost. They are left deliberately or otherwise in places that remember. The keys in the hollow step are not hidden. They are remembered, each one a different story. Not in sequence, not in language, but in sensation. The slight give of a rusted lock, the resistance of a forgotten drawer, the click of a door that no longer opens. He has never used them in Watson's presence. Likely never will. They are not keys to be turned, they are keys to be kept, not for their function, but for what they once opened, what they still symbolize. Holmes is a man of action, of analysis, of fierce momentum, but he is also a man of thresholds, of moments between. And the hollow step, the quiet stare, the bundle wrapped in linen, these are not mysteries to be solved. They are pauses in the narrative, markers of things he will never speak aloud, he once said, with the firelight flickering against the brass of the fireplace tools. There are rooms that only exist in memory, locked behind no door, opened by nothing but silence. And perhaps these keys are for those rooms, rooms never built, people never named, farewells never spoken. The cloth beneath the third step holds them all. And Holmes, whose hands are so often employed to unravel, undo, uncover, leaves this one thing wrapped, preserved, untouched, save for the occasional visitation in the quietest hours of the night. He will go to them again. Not tonight, perhaps. Not tomorrow, but someday soon, when the world presses too loudly at the edges of Baker Street, when deduction has lost its rhythm and the cases have gone quiet. He will descend alone to the stairs. He will press his heel gently to the worn board and listen for that particular creak. Then he will kneel and unwrap the silence once more. At the far end of Baker Street, where the morning sun has yet to touch the upper floors, there is a narrow desk by the window of 221B. It is not Holmes's writing table, not the one used for monographs, diagrams, or casework, but a smaller surface, lacquered in dark stain, tucked into the quiet corner where dust gathers slowly and thought drifts toward memory. On this desk, beside an empty inkwell and a single chipped cup once used for sealing wax, lies a notebook, unremarkable in appearance. Its cover bears no title, its spine is softened from handling, and its pages, if glimpsed by passing eyes, appear nearly blank. There are words written there, but they fade. Not with time, with light. By candle or lamplight, the ink appears, soft, sepia-toned, and delicate, like handwriting glimpsed in a dream. But when dawn breaks and sunlight spills across the room, the words dissolve, not erased, not bleached, but vanished. Holmes keeps no label on the notebook. He refers to it as nothing, mentions it not even to Watson. But it has been there always, in that same position, slightly angled, as though a hand had just withdrawn from the page. And beside it, a pen, dry, always dry, with a fine nib polished to the sheen of long familiarity. Watson once stumbled upon it during one of Holmes's long absences, when the flat had grown quiet and the dust had not yet settled from the previous evening's case. The morning sun had just begun to slip through the curtains, brushing against the corner of the desk. Watson lifted the cover. The first few pages were empty, but on the sixth, when a passing cloud drew momentary shadow across the glass, faint lines emerged, barely legible, fragments of phrases, words cut mid-thought, punctuation placed with the care of someone writing not to be read, but to remember. Holmes returned before the light fully shifted. Watson closed the book and said nothing. Holmes only nodded. And the notebook remained. There are theories, of course, mostly Watson's. Some say the ink is a compound of Holmes's own design, meant to fade with ultraviolet exposure. Others suspect a kind of chemical diary used to hide thoughts unfit for even private eyes. But none of those guesses feel quite right. The words, when they appear, carry not the tone of strategy, but of something softer. They are not records. They are reflections, not instruction, but confession. On one such night, a wind-heavy evening that rattled the panes and left soot along the hearth, Holmes sat at the desk with the single lamp lit low. His hand moved across the page in measured strokes, no urgency in the lines. When Watson passed by, he did not look up. He continued writing, his face calm, his posture eased. And when the page was filled, he closed the book, pressed his palm lightly against the cover, and extinguished the lamp dot in the morning. Nothing remained, only the page, only the silence, only the faint lingering scent of ink and something warmer. Perhaps bergamot or the leather from Holmes's gloves. The notebook never fills. Somehow the pages replenish. Or perhaps they are reused. Perhaps the act of fading allows for memory without accumulation. A cycle of thought that rises, vanishes, and is made ready again. You begin to understand this is not secrecy, this is release. Holmes, who remembers everything, must sometimes let something go. Not discard it, not destroy it, just offer it. Up to the night, to allow thought to exist briefly and then disappear with the sun. The flat on such mornings is a little quieter, the tea is brewed without comment. The violin is not played, and Holmes, seated by the hearth with a newspaper folded in his lap, turns pages more slowly as if some part of him is still listening to the words that faded hours ago. The act of writing, for Holmes, was never a matter of habit. He did not keep a daily journal. He did not draft long letters, nor did he record his cases with any regularity beyond what Watson preserved. Paper, to Holmes, was often a means, not a place, except here dotted the small desk in the corner of 221B. Beside the narrow-paned window, the page becomes something else entirely. It becomes a threshold, only in the late hours, well past the time most of London retires, when even the coal carts have stopped their final rounds and the embers in. The hearth leaned toward silence. Does Holmes begin? The lamp is lit low, just enough illumination to see the flow of ink as it appears across the page. The notebook lies open, not flipped from the front, but always turned to the next available page with deliberate care. And the pen, always the same, slender, black-bodied, slightly chipped at the base, glides with the softness of something. Long practiced and seldom shared dot, the words come slowly, never in paragraphs. More often in fragments, arranged not as conclusions, but as offerings, observations, impressions, questions never asked aloud. You might catch a glimpse, if the angle of light were just so. Her silence carried more weight than truth. Clock striking 12 and still no footsteps. Not loneliness, only the shape of someone once expected. These are not deductions, not clues. They are weather patterns of the heart. Emotional residue, thoughts Holmes cannot place elsewhere. Once, during a particularly long winter, when fog curled for days over the Thames, and even the gas lamps burned as pale as frost, Watson entered the sitting room to find Holmes asleep. At the desk, his head resting on folded arms, the pen still cradled in his fingers. The notebook was open. The page, just barely touched by the lamp's light, held a few faint words. Watson could not read them. He did not try. He only pulled a blanket over Holmes's shoulders and turned on the flame dot in the morning. The page was blank again. Later, Holmes made tea without comment dot, and the routine of Baker Street resumed, papers rustling, Watson humming quietly as he reviewed correspondence. Holmes pacing once or twice before settling into his chair, but something had shifted. A quiet had settled over the room, not tension, not weariness, but something deeper. The kind of quiet that comes from having released a thought that no longer wished to be carried. Holmes once remarked, in one of his rare moods of openness, there are things not meant to be remembered, but not meant to be forgotten either. And this was the notebook's purpose, not as memory, not as archive dot, but as passing, a place for thoughts to arrive, speak softly, and vanish before they grew too heavy dot. You begin to notice that Holmes never writes when the fire is high. Never when Watson is nearby, never when music plays. He waits for the room to empty, not of people, but of sound. When the silence becomes full enough to hold what cannot be spoken, the ink itself, whatever compound he's devised, does not smudge. It glows faintly under lamplight, darkens when cooled by shadow, and then fades entirely with the morning's first touch of sun. There is a peace in that disappearance, a kind of unburdening. Holmes, who so often accumulates data, inference, detail, emotion withheld, uses the notebook not to keep, but to let go. And in doing so, he returns to himself a little more gently each time. You can almost feel it, the soft hiss of the pen, the whisper of the page turning, the breath held between one thought and the next. And you understand, this is Holmes at his most human, not the detective, not the intellect, but the man who writes something briefly, simply because it needs to be written, and then lets it vanish, The room holds its breath just before dawn. That rare shade of light, neither night nor day, drapes itself across the window panes of 221B like a veil, softening everything it touches. The fireplace has cooled. The city stirs faintly beyond the glass. But inside, in this quiet chamber of wood and paper and thought, time does not rush forward. It leans gently, waiting. The notebook rests open. A single line stretches across the center of the page, faint but legible, still clinging to shadow before the sun arrives. Holmes is not at the desk. He has stepped away, perhaps only to the armchair, where his figure settles lightly into the worn cushion, fingers steepled, gaze not fixed on any one thing. He is listening, not to the street, not to Watson's slow turning of a page upstairs, but to the final moments of the words he released hours ago. The line reads, "Some truths are meant only to be spoken in vanishing ink." As the light strengthens, the letters begin to pale. The sepia thins, the strokes loosen. The line fades, first at the edges, then the middle. Finally, the sentence lets go of itself entirely. Holmes does not watch it disappear. He does not need to dot. It is the act that matters, not the permanence. These are not journals, not records, not clues preserved for posterity. They are moments of release, passed from mind to page to morning air, never stored, never repeated. Watson, though he has seen the notebook on occasion, never speaks of it. He understands, instinctively, that this ritual lies outside the boundaries of their shared world, not in secrecy, but in sanctity. It belongs to a quiet Holmes, a version rarely seen, who visits the page only when silence invites him. Once, long ago, Holmes returned from a case in the north, a case that left no injuries, no headlines, no fanfare, but it lingered in his step, in the tight set of his jaw, in the way he moved with a slow, deliberate quiet for 3 full days. On the third night, Watson descended the stairs and saw the flicker of lamplight against the desk. He did not enter, but the next morning he noticed the notebook had shifted ever so slightly. Its ribbon moved, its corners aligned anew. And in the moment between pulling on his coat and reaching for his walking stick, Watson paused. He felt it in the room, not a change, not a confession, but a lightening. Whatever had been written and vanished had lifted something Holmes had carried alone. That is what the ink is for, not permanence, not proof, but letting go. Now, as the morning breaks over Baker Street, Holmes closes the book softly. He smooths the cover with the palm of his hand, then returns it to its familiar place on the desk. Slightly angled, quiet, waiting, he does not lock it away, because it is not meant to be hidden. Only honored. The pen rests beside it, the lamp is turned down. And Holmes, now standing, crosses the room without a sound. He pours tea, quietly, methodically, and stirs it once. No sugar, no milk. He moves to the window and watches the city wake, boots on pavement, carriages shifting through. Fog. The first newspaper lad calling faintly from the corner. Watson descends a moment later, his expression soft with sleep. They speak little, The day will begin as all their days do, with inquiry, with ritual, with unspoken care. But the room holds something else now, a stillness, a softness, the trace of something written, then released. And in that space, in that fading ink, Holmes becomes, for a moment, weightless. In the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, beside the hearth where shadows collect beneath the mantel, stands a small drawer cabinet of modest construction. It is not ornate. Its knobs are wooden, worn soft with time. Its joints creak slightly. When opened, the grain of the oak bears a few uneven marks, as though someone once dragged a knife across its edge in distraction. To most, it is just furniture, a place for stray buttons, wax seals, folded correspondence, the odd fuse or matchbook. But within the second drawer from the top, there rests a single dark brown leather glove, left hand only. The stitching is tight, precise. The fingers are long, but not narrow. The cuff flares slightly, lined with a faint trace of wool. It is not worn out, but it has been used. The leather is pliable, shaped by a hand that once wore it often, yet it bears no partner. The right hand. Glove is nowhere to be found, nor has it ever been, not in Watson's time, nor before. Holmes does not speak of the glove. He never uses it, and he never moves it from the drawer, but it is there. Always. You see it now, nestled beside a sheet of tissue paper, folded precisely as though someone once packed it for safekeeping but stopped before the lid was closed. The glove does not face out. It is turned slightly inward, palm side down. Sleeping. Watson, ever curious in his early days, discovered it by accident. He was searching for sealing wax and opened the wrong drawer. His eyes fell on the glove, unexpected, singular. He hesitated, unsure whether to lift it. Then, sensing something in the stillness around it, he gently closed the drawer again. He never asked Holmes about it. Not out of fear. Out of respect. Because some objects, once found, seemed to declare themselves complete. The glove did not ask to be explained. It asked only to be kept. On quiet evenings, when the rain patters softly against the glass and the fire hums in its low voice, Holmes sometimes sits in the armchair facing that drawer. He does not reach for it. He does not even glance toward it, but his stillness shifts slightly. The posture of someone who remembers not a moment, but the feeling of one. Once, after a long day of interviews in alleyways, Holmes returned home soaked to the bone. Watson fetched a towel, Mrs. Hudson set tea beside the fire, and Holmes, instead of changing, sat down in his damp coat and stared into the hearth. He said only one sentence that night. She wore it on the last day she looked back. Watson, unsure whether it was an echo from a case or something deeper, said nothing. And the sentence remained in the air, light as breath. Heavy as stone. No name was offered. No explanation followed. But the next morning, when Watson rose early to read, he noticed something. The drawer had been opened slightly in the night, barely an inch, and the glove, though still resting in its place, had been turned, just slightly. Palm up. It was returned by evening. No further mention was made. Holmes never treated it as relic or keepsake. It was not displayed, it was not sealed away. It simply lived in its drawer beside paper and dust, with the dignity of something deliberately unfinished. You understand it now. The glove was not part of a mystery. It was the part left out of one, a detail never spoken, a person never named, a day never written into any casebook. And in that absence, it holds its shape. Evening lengthens slowly over Baker Street. The fire is lit, but low. Its warmth reaches only the closest edges of the hearth. Light from the nearby street lamp filters through the front window, casting the room in shades of amber and gray. Somewhere beyond the glass, rain continues, not with urgency, but with rhythm. In the stillness, the drawer remains closed. Yet the presence of The glove inside it feels almost audible. Holmes sits in the armchair by the fire. His eyes are not fixed on any particular object. The newspaper at his side lies folded, unopened. The cold tongs rest idle. And though his hands are clasped gently together, his fingers remain slightly parted, as though remembering the shape of something once held, and long since released. He does not speak, but his stillness speaks for him. There are certain objects that, despite their size or purpose, alter the atmosphere of a room. This glove, so quietly placed, so rarely touched, does just that. It gathers time. Not like a clock, but like a pause held between thoughts. A breath that remains suspended. Watson once described it as the most quietly present thing in the room. He was right. The glove has no case attached to it, no documented client, no court records or monographs or coded letters to hint at its origin. It is not mentioned in Holmes's own notes, nor in any of Watson's published writings. It lives only in this drawer known by few, understood by fewer. And yet it holds weight, not of evidence, but of memory. Holmes, when asked about sentiment, often deflects. He cites logic, clarity, the dangers of emotional fog. But even Watson, no stranger to Holmes's mental architecture, has observed those rare and quiet hours when logic is not what anchors him. Tonight is one of them. He rises from the chair after some time, not abruptly, not with purpose. Simply, from stillness into motion, he crosses the floor. The fire casts a wavering reflection across his shoulder as he reaches the drawer. It opens without a sound. Inside, the glove remains. Holmes does not remove it. He lifts the edge of the folded tissue paper, adjusts it gently, and smooths the corners. Then his hand hovers, not to grasp, but to acknowledge. His fingertips brush the cuff, and for a moment, you see the slightest shift in his posture, a memory returning, not in clarity, not in pain, but in presence. He does not speak, but the silence deepens around him. Holmes closes the drawer just as carefully as he opened it. No creak, no weight, only a soft return to stillness. Then he resumes his place by the fire. The room breathes again. It is not grief that lives in that drawer. Nor longing. It is something more rare and more restrained. Recognition. Of something real. Something once worn. Someone once close enough to leave behind a glove, and the deliberate choice not to retrieve it. Watson once theorized, quietly and without pressing, that the glove had belonged to a woman. There were signs, the length of the fingers, the width of the palm, the delicate taper at the cuff. But Holmes, when gently asked, offered only this: it was never about who left it, only that it was left at all. That Watson understood. It is not the object that matters, but the gesture, the remaining. The refusal to discard or explain. The glove is not forgotten. It is not held in mourning. It is simply held. As if some memories do not fade or grow distant. They take up residence. Quiet, permanent. UNDMANDING. The drawer clicks softly shut. Holmes closes his eyes for a moment, and in that moment, the glove remains, not as a symbol, not as a mystery, but as a quiet, tangible truth. Morning returns gently to 221B. It does not burst in with brightness nor command attention. Instead, it arrives like the settling of ash, like mist curling beneath the window panes, a gradual easing of shadow from the floorboards, a quiet gold along the fringe of the drapes. The fire has gone cold in the grate, but the scent of coal lingers, soft, lingering, familiar. The drawer remains closed, and yet it feels present, the way a word once spoken still echoes silently in a room long after the sound has faded, moves through the flat with the care of someone who knows every creaking plank, every uneven tile, every corner where a memory might rest. He does not look toward the drawer today, But you sense that he's aware of it, just as Holmes always is, not directly, not consciously, but the way one notices a door that is always slightly ajar. Holmes is awake already. He stands at the mantel, gaze turned outward, not toward the city, but toward the soft pattern of the wallpaper beside the hearth, the place where the light strikes first, just beside the cabinet, where the drawer lives in quiet anonymity. He lifts a cup of tea to his lips. The cup is warm, not steaming. The sort of heat that has settled in, grown calm. His hand does not tremble. His eyes do not narrow. But still, something rests in him, something unspoken. You understand it now. The glove is not a wound, nor is it a relic. It is a decision. To remember not in detail, but in gesture. To keep without retelling. To carry without unpacking. It has stayed in that drawer for years. Not hidden, not claimed, not dismissed. Just kept. Once, only once, Holmes spoke of it aloud. It was not prompted. No case surrounded the moment. No letter arrived to stir the past. He and Watson had been seated at opposite ends of the room, the windows fogged, the fire casting thin shadows against the backs of their chairs. Holmes had been silent for nearly half an hour. Then, without turning his head, he said, "She left it behind on purpose." Watson looked up. Holmes continued, his voice steady, not nostalgic, not bitter. "I knew she would." She said nothing. But when she reached for her coat, she turned, her hand in just such a way that it slid loose from her grip and fell beside the chair. And she did not retrieve it. There was a pause. She never intended to. Watson did not ask who she was, and Holmes offered no name. He only added, more quietly, it was not meant to be followed, only found. And that was the end of it. The glove stayed in the drawer. From then onward, Holmes never touched it again, at least not while Watson was present. But he would, on certain evenings, rest his gaze on the cabinet. Not long. Not with longing. With recognition. Some people leave traces. Others leave silences. And some leave a single object behind, not as a message, but as a mark of closure left gently ajar. Holmes, for all his brilliance, for all his steel-edged logic, for all his guarded heart, had chosen to keep this one. Traced. Not explained, not erased. Just present. Now, as morning leans into midday, the drawer does not open. It does not need to. Its contents are known. Its memory is steady. Its silence continues to keep, and in this flat of papers and boots and coal and echoes, the glove remains, not a mystery, not a memento, but a truth without words. There is a grandfather clock in the far alcove of 221B Baker Street, taller than a man, darker than the wood that frames the mantel. It stands silently just past the threshold of the sitting room's inner corridor, that narrow bend between the breakfast table and the back of the bookshelf, where dust gathers slower than sound. It is not part of the room's daily rhythm. It does not command attention the way Holmes's chemistry table or Watson's stack of journals might. But it is always there, always ticking, yet it is never wound. Holmes insists it has never needed it. At first glance, the clock appears ordinary, handsome, even. The wood is aged mahogany, smooth with age, free from ornament except for a narrow strip of floral carving along the base. Its glass face is clouded with time, the numerals bold but worn, the hands curved in a delicate filigree style rarely seen outside of provincial French makers. It is never late. Not once has it failed to chime the hour, soft, low, steady, a note closer to breath than to bell. And though the inner gears remain untouched by Holmes's otherwise tireless adjustments and experiments, the clock has kept time flawlessly since Watson first moved in. Watson finds this strange not because it's unusual. Baker Street has long trained him to accept unusual things, but because Holmes who distrusts mechanisms he hasn't personally examined, has never opened the casing dot in all the years they've shared the flat. Holmes has examined locks from Vienna, clocks from the pawn job, and music boxes from a client's ruined estate in Surrey. But not this one. He will not even lift the glass panel. The clock keeps itself. He once said, not with certainty, but with finality, and so it does. Yet there is something else. Something Watson never recorded in his notes, never asked Holmes directly, perhaps because it feels like a memory one might have dreamt, the kind of recollection that returns only in rainstorms or just before waking